So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at a creationist that, to my memory, I've never covered before, Walter Veith. Walter was a lapsed Catholic, but then his daughter got sick. For some reason, Walter became convinced that she was demon-possessed and called priest. Apparently, after the visit from the priest, she got better, and so Walter and his wife returned to being practicing Catholics. After a while, though, they started having doubts about Catholicism, and so became Adventists under the influence of a contractor doing work for them. After that, Walter became a creationist as demanded by Adventism, and had a rocky career in academia, since, he was telling lies to students. Anyway, he managed to have a full-length career in academia, although he bounced around for a bit. Now he's retired and spends his time doing pastoring stuff and lecturing about evolution and creation. He is here being interviewed for a show called LED Live, and this is the one and only episode of that show I've ever seen. So I don't have any opinion on the hosts, nor do I know their positions on any questions not addressed here. Anyway, let's see what another scientist who abandoned reality for emotional reasons has to say about the science that doesn't help him feel warm and fuzzy inside.
Welcome back to LED Live, everybody. We have an awesome special guest today. I know I say that every single time, but today is an awesome special guest. I'm very excited.
You know what, Scotty? Me too. Although, probably not for the same reason.
Walter Veith, thank you for coming by on our show.
It's a pleasure.
If you guys don't know who this guy is and his ministry, we're going to put some links in the description below.
I'm not putting the links in the description. If you want to go find Walter, I'm sure your Google Foo is sufficient.
You will be blessed by the amazing information that you guys have put out. And we're going to get into a topic that we haven't actually covered very much before. Have we actually talked about evolution at all?
Not that I remember.
No. Yeah.
Well, that probably means that our hosts, Scotty, Keith, and Kendi, won't know enough to give any pushback to anything Walter has to say. That doesn't really fill me with confidence, but okay, let's skip until Walter actually has something to say. Because really, I'm here to look at his points, not the intro of some hosts, none of whom I'm familiar with, and none of whom are the ones claiming to be knowledgeable about the topic.
Well, I was a professor in zoology, but my speciality was animal physiology, comparative animal physiology.
Well, that's kind of true. He was relegated to physiology after he was removed from being a biology professor for, teaching kids things we know not to be true. I don't know the degree to which physiology was his field back when he was still teaching general biology, but his shift to teaching physiology in particular was something that happened later in his career, well after his conversion to Adventism. Note that I'm just getting that from Wikipedia. It's not the best source, but also frankly, while the exact details of his biography are relevant, they're also not the most important thing. So for this purpose, I think it's fine. If you disagree, let me know what I got wrong or what Wikipedia got wrong about his life, and how you know. If it's compelling, I'll offer a correction.
So that gives you a pretty broad spectrum, and you can move into animal experimentation that even links onto the medical world.
Yep, in fact, at one point, he was hired on as just a researcher and not allowed to teach, presumably because he's actually good at things like experiments, data collection, and the like. I have long maintained that creationists are in fact capable of doing science, it's just that most tend not to.
So I also became a professor in medical bioscience.
That part I'm less sure about. But also, I'm done with his biography. His credentials exist, are fairly ordinary for someone working in a biology department, and I don't really care to contest his story of his biography. Let's get to the claims about science. So after a few more biographical details, the host Scotty asks him how he could be a biologist looking at the amazingness of creation and not acknowledging a creator.
There was no maker. Evolution doesn't allow for a divine foot in the door.
Yeah.
And here we get to our first lie. Evolution no more requires or precludes a divine creator than does the theory of universal gravitation, the oxygen theory of fire, the germ theory of disease, or atomic theory. Most Christians belong to Christian sects which do not require them to reject evolution or find science to be at odds with their teachings. Well, I'm not here to be anyone's pastor, prophet, priest, or anything like that. It is simply not the case that evolution demands atheism.
There is no creator, so whether you speak to the guys at Oxford or at Cambridge or any one of them, there is no room for deity in any of this. Everything has to be explained naturalistic.
So among Oxford and Cambridge biologists who accept evolution, none are theists. I find that very unlikely, but unsurprisingly, neither school really lists their faculty by religious affiliation, so I will use an American proxy. Francis Collins is a famous biologist who accepts evolution and is also very open about his Christian faith. He earned a degree and later taught at Yale University, one of the top universities in the former United States. Indeed, it has been ranked in the top 10 schools worldwide. So while I'm not really willing to go into a deep dive into the biology faculty at Cambridge and Oxford, the wider point that theists are not welcome in biology departments in top schools is just not true.
And yet each of them would go to court if anyone tried to put their name on their body of work. You know, they want the credit when it comes to research or anything that they created, but no credit to what they're observing.
What the hell is she talking about? Last I checked, Christians and atheists and most other people want to put their names on their work, and even when they don't, it's important that those assessing their work after it passes peer review have a way to contact the authors. So even if they did not want their names on their work, they'd be required to put it there anyway. What in the world does this have to do with theism?
Yes. Now, if you take people like Richard Dawkins, for example, he's a very outspoken evolutionist. He is against God in every sense of the word.
I mean, except for his weird insistence on being a cultural Christian and hating Islam with that as part of his excuse.
But he identifies as a cultural Christian.
Oh, I didn't know that's where Walter was going with it.
Interesting.
So that's very interesting.
I mean, not really. He wants to be a bigot, and Christian culture is full of precedents for bigotry. That's not to say that you have to be a bigot to be a Christian. You do not. But if you do want to be one, there's a fair chance you could find examples of your preferred bigotry in Christian history. It's not just a coincidence that the KKK is a Christian organization.
So I found that fascinating. But he wrote a book called The God Delusion.
Yeah.
I don't care about that book or about defending Dawkins. I'm pretty much as much of an anti-fan of the God Delusion as Walter is, although obviously not for all the same reasons. But I'm not here to defend Dawkins of all people, or his crappy philosophy writing.
I remember being in school, and of course we got a lot of evolution because I was a science major, and
Yep, you sure do get a lot of science when you're a science major. Keith is right.
you know, to read papers by Stephen Gould and people like that. And I would say most of my professors were professed Christians. They went to the Methodist Church or whatever. And
Which directly contradicts Veith's point that Christians aren't welcome on the teaching staff of universities. Scientists don't put their religion down on their papers. Their research stands or falls on the data, and the data isn't tagged with Methodist, Twelver Shiite, Karaite, Theravada Buddhist, atheist, or anything else like that. Your religious affiliation really doesn't matter in science unless you use it as an excuse to do bad science.
I remember sitting in one class, I think it was Biochem 2, and they were having a discussion. I usually just listened a lot.
It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt.
One lady, she said, you know, she was talking about being a Christian, but how she found evolution, there was so much overwhelming evidence that it was just undeniable. And I was like, wow.
Sounds like she was smart and did not allow her confirmation or in-group bias to cloud her assessment of the evidence from science. Good for her. And she is yet more evidence that you do not need to stop being a Christian in order to accept the evidence of biological evolution. Anti-evolution is not the Christian position. It is one position among many that Christians hold. Creationists, including young earth creationists, do not have a monopoly on Christianity.
To think that you have gone to that point, and I always had a hard time, like, how are you living with yourself, you know, sitting in both worlds? But
you just don't take Genesis 1 through 11 literally and recognize that it is a series of ideologies used by the ancient Hebrews to understand their relationship with God, as well as the relationship of other nations to their gods, the God of the Hebrews, as well as each other. It's really not that complicated. The only reason it might be complicated is if you just decided that Genesis 1 through 11 actually have to be historical no matter what, evidence be damned. You could just, you know, not do that.
in science, and this is one thing I try to clarify for people, is when, and you'd be able to speak to this, but when they talk about evolution being a theory, the word theory is used differently in science than it is in the general vocabulary.
Wow, it's usually I who have to point that out to creationists, and not them who point it out. Keith is completely right here. In common parlance, a theory is just a guess. In science, it is a well-supported explanation for a set of phenomena that connects otherwise disparate datasets into a framework that explains them together, predicts the outcome of future tests, and suggests new areas of research. It's not at all a guess, and it takes a lot of time and evidence for an idea to reach the level of theory. Theory is the highest level an idea can reach in science apart from perhaps the basic axioms that allow science to function at all, such as the regularity of nature.
We use the term theory kind of loosely, like, oh, it's just a theory, like it's some,
it's not really
like
true.
It doesn't hold a lot of weight. In science, theory holds a lot more weight than it would in just, everyday vocabulary. And so for them, theory is right before something becomes a law.
And then he screws it up. Theories do not become laws, nor do laws become theories. Instead, laws are incorporated into theories. A scientific law is a mathematical relationship that has been shown to hold true within the boundary conditions for the law, or at least within conditions that reasonably approximate them. For example, the second law of thermodynamics says that the energy available to do work in an isolated system must either go down or stay the same over time. That's a mathematical relationship between time and energy. Newton's law of gravitation says that all masses are attracted to each other proportional to the sum of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Those were never theories, and instead, the second law of thermodynamics is actually now part of quantum theory, as we can now explain why it occurs in terms of the interaction of subatomic particles, which is the kind of phenomenon dealt with by that theory. Newton's law of gravitation is now part of the theory of general relativity, which deals with the bending of spacetime caused by mass, which is the cause of gravity. And we know that under a wide range of speeds, masses, and distances, Newton's laws remains accurate within our ability to measure. Laws, as I stated, also have boundary conditions. For example, if a system is not isolated, then new energy can be introduced, and that energy may be able to do work in the system, which is why the second law of thermodynamics does not apply to all systems. Similarly, as previously stated, Newton's law of universal gravitation is valid within a certain range of masses and distances. But outside of that, we need a more complex but more accurate law, because we have violated the boundary conditions of the law. Some laws, such as the ideal gas laws, have boundary conditions that are technically never met, but that are met closely enough that we can still use them. The ideal gas laws, for example, assume that the particles that make up a gas do not interact with each other. We know that not to be true, but because their interactions are, under most conditions, very infrequent compared to their interactions with the walls of their containers, the conditions are close enough. So I hope that you can now see what a theory is, what a law is, and why one never becomes the other.
But fascinating, evolution has never become a law. Why?
Because it does not describe an interaction that can be reduced down to an equation with units and numbers. But then that's also true for the germ theory of disease. What law could you possibly derive from the fact that many diseases are caused by microscopic pathogens? You could certainly come up with some laws about pathogens or diseases, or things like virulence, etc., but none of those are the germ theory of disease. They're parts of it. Similarly, there are laws in evolution, such as the mathematical relationships between effective population size, genetic drift, and the likelihood of a neutral allele being fixed or lost in a population. That's not itself the theory of evolution, and it never will be, but it is a law and it is part of evolution.
Because there's never been enough evidence to consider it to be a law in science, like gravity.
Nope, it's because Keith here is making a category error. There has been plenty of evidence in evolutionary biology for laws, which is why there are laws, mostly in population genetics. But those laws don't have catchy names and aren't usually taught in high school. Although Mendel's laws of inheritance are, and those are also part of evolutionary biology insofar as their conditions are met. But let's see if Veith, who knows better, will correct him or not.
It's past the point of hypothesis. It's come to the point of theory.
Yeah.
But you must understand the mindset.
Nope, it seems he will not. Because why bother correcting scientific illiteracy while presenting yourself as a scientist in a public forum?
There is no God.
Yeah.
Weird, because Keith had just said that the mindset of most of his professors who were teaching evolution was Methodist or similar. Methodists aren't really known for not believing in God, so I guess Walter is just lying, or he doesn't believe Keith and is too chicken shit to say so.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the line, something had to come into existence.
Which is entirely outside the scope of the theory of evolution. Evolution assumes that life exists and makes no attempt to account for that fact. Similarly, the germ theory of disease assumes that both germs and hosts exist. It doesn't matter to the germ theory whether the germs and or the hosts were created by God just now, whether they evolved or what. They exist and they act in ways that are accounted for by the theory. Similarly, the theory of general relativity does not account for where mass or space come from. It simply describes and predicts their interaction. We as yet do not have a theory about the origin of life, although there are people working on many, sometimes mutually compatible hypotheses regarding it. But as far as the theory of evolution per se goes, it does not matter where the first life came from, only that it existed.
And the only plausible theory that we have is the theory of evolution.
Well, evolution is the only theory we have that explains biodiversity, but that's not the same thing as the origin of life. But also, in being the only theory, it is inappropriate to pretend in a classroom there is another option available to science until such an option is actually presented in a way that it can exceed the predictive and explanatory power of evolution.
So even if it fails on certain points, you have to prop it up with pillars in other places in order to make it stand.
But that's the thing. It doesn't fail anywhere. Sure, we don't know everything about the evolution of life on Earth, but that's not a failure of the theory, that's a lack of data. A failure of the theory would be a finding that contradicts the theory. There have been no such findings. That's why it's still a theory and not a former theory, like the luminiferous ether or the phlogiston theory of fire, both of which were theories that have since been overturned.
Because the alternative, God, is just too ghastly to contemplate.
Yeah.
Except that God, in the big G Christian sense, isn't the alternative. It's one among a potentially infinite number of alternatives. Maybe panpsychism is true and the universe as a whole just arranged itself into life. Maybe we're all just the dream of Azathoth. Maybe we're all Thetans imagining the messed universe into existence as a game. There is no dichotomy of evolution or the God Veith believes in.
Well, this coming into our world's existence in the late 1800s, right? Charles Darwin came up with this kind of a concept, and if he was really truly tutored by the devil, right?
I'm sorry, but,
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Darwin can't just be wrong. He has to be under the tutelage of Satan himself. Just as a reminder, when Darwin was on the Beagle, and for most of the time he was compiling his data and coming up with his idea of natural selection, he was a Christian. Granted, he was a Unitarian, which many Christians consider outside the fold or in, but only barely. But he certainly believed in God, and had some religious place for Jesus. Although exactly what that wasn't exactly the same as it is in more mainstream Christian groups. But he certainly was a believer. Do these guys and Kendi believe that it's either their version of Christianity or Satan worship as a dichotomy? Was Darwin tricked by Satan? How does being a pupil of Satan work? Are there pop quizzes? Does he give marks for attendance?
There must be a really good reason why that's brought out in the end of the world.
Christians have been predicting the end of the world now for almost 2 millennia. They've been wrong every time so far. I bet this guy is wrong now.
Yes. Well, why would you want to negate the book of Genesis?
That's not what people are doing. Scientists generally do not care about negating or confirming the book of Genesis. I've never met or heard of any scientist who got into science so they could disprove Genesis. Just like no one gets into NASA because they want to hide the flat Earth. No one goes into science to hide the young Earth. It's just that Earth isn't flat or young. Evolution is real, vaccines work, 5G isn't a laser weapon, we landed on the moon, and there is no such thing as chemtrails. The idea that there is some scientific conspiracy to hide the truth, TM, is just lunatic conspiracy talk. And fun fact, if you want to say that there's a conspiracy to hide the truth you advocate for, you will have to demonstrate the truth of your claim, but now also the truth of the claim that there is a conspiracy. Claiming a conspiracy only ever makes the job of providing evidence for your non-consensus view harder.
Because the Genesis book tells you about the beginnings, number one, and it tells you about the reasons for the state of the world, what happened in the beginning, the loss of certain privileges that were associated with creation.
I don't see how any of that is a reason to hide anything or to fake science or anything of the kind. Science is also incompatible with the stories of the prose Edda being literally true. Does Walt think that there is also an attempt in science to delegitimize the Eddas? What about the Vedas? Do scientists only try to delegitimize the Bible because they all secretly know it's true? That seems like a weird thing to do, since if I knew that a particular part of the Bible was true, I would live my life like someone who knew that, not like someone who didn't while trying to cover it up. What could I possibly hope to gain by doing that?
And then you have the book of Revelation, which is the antithesis to the book of Genesis.
That is definitely not how I'd put it. Revelation is an exhortation to Christians under the reign of Emperor Nero to stay faithful and trust that God will save them. It uses apocalyptic imagery to describe the situation as well as the deliverance of Christians from the Neronian persecution. It's not about the end of the world, it's not about today, and there's a good reason that it is not included in the prescribed readings during the liturgies of the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. It's because when people get too into it, they come up with dumb shit that has bad consequences for real people. After this, he just keeps droning on and on about connections between Genesis, Revelation, and eschatological musings that are basically just things he's imagining. I don't really care about that, so we'll cut back when he has something more to say about science.
Now, when I was an atheist,
So, after he was a Catholic and before he had an exorcism performed on his daughter. Got it.
we used to embrace the religious people coming to our university and presenting creationist ideas.
I get that. It's like when I sometimes fire up Doom or Halo, put it on easy, and just relax by ripping and tearing or giving the Covenant back their bomb. Sometimes it's nice to just have some easy targets to shred. Of course, in the context of creationist yokels, it's more in the intellectual sense than in the sense of chainsaws, plasma rifles, and grenades. At least, I hope so. It's not okay to use lethal weapons on creationists just because they're creationists. You have to wait until they actually threaten you or others, like by electing a narcissistic man-child who will act as a pawn for neo-Nazis and Christian nationalists as your next king. Just kidding. Or am I?
Because we had great sport taking it apart afterwards and ridiculing it.
Yeah.
As long as you're not ridiculing the student, just the ideas. The average creationist who just shows up at a university isn't a creationist because they're stupid or evil, like Walter here. They're just ignorant. No one should be mocked for ignorance unless it's willing. And that is not a good assumption to make about some kid who just shows up in your biology class. It's much more likely that, like me, they were lied to about science through their whole childhood. That's something that demands empathy, gentleness, and understanding. Until they show themselves to be intentionally dishonest, like the average professional creationist, they should be treated as victims of being raised by conspiracy theorists, not as originators or spreaders of conspiracy theories. Because let's be clear, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and intelligent design are conspiracy theories designed to move society towards Christofascism.
And in that way, we were very successful in changing the minds of students.
Well done, I guess.
I mean, we live in a very conservative country. I come from South Africa, and most people are religious when they come to the university. And within 3 years, we drive that out of them.
I'm skeptical of that. There's nothing incompatible about evolution and being religious. Sure, some religions are incompatible with that aspect of science, but others aren't. Then again, realizing you've been lied to by your religious leaders for your whole childhood isn't exactly the kind of thing that makes people want to stay in their childhood religion. But I feel like that's more on the creationists for lying than on the professors for dismantling the lies.
There was a statistical study of how this is actually achieved and how the mindsets are switched. And they have Christian organizations working at the university campus with students to convince them that evolution is correct and that they have to adopt a theistic evolution hypothesis.
Good, as they should. And hey, if you're a Christian looking for pro-science Christian material, I would suggest that you check out BioLogos. They are an evolution-accepting Christian ministry. They will show you how you can be a Christian who does not feel duty-bound to reject science. We need more such people in the world, especially at a time like this when vaccine hesitancy is spreading in Christian communities.
In order to fit into the world, otherwise you will be contrary to what is good science.
If by fitting into the world, Walter means accepting things for which there is good evidence, then I feel like Christians should strive to do that.
So the aim even of Christian organizations often is to divert the mind away from what Scripture says to what is a compromise between Scripture and human thinking.
There is a problem with this framing, and it's that Scripture doesn't say one thing. If you want to make the Bible say that the earth is flat, you can. If you want to make it say that genetics works by sympathetic magic, you can. If you want to make it say that salvation is by faith and not works, you can. If you want to make it say that salvation requires work, you can. If you want to make it say that Jesus is God, you can. If you want to make it say he's not, you can. If you want to make it say bishops should be married, you can. If you want to make it say that no one should get married, you can. If you want to make it say slavery is good, you can. If you want to make it say slavery is bad, you can do that too. Christian beliefs do not primarily come from the Bible. They come from the traditions of Christian groups, as well as the struggle to make the traditions and the Bible relevant to the people who use them as authorities. Most creationists think that the Bible says that slavery is wrong, that people ought to get married, that sex is good within that context and not outside of it, marriage ought to be between a single man and a single woman, that bishops are something that Catholics made up, and that the earth is a sphere. it is trivially easy to make the opposite case for each of those points. So already, Walter's theology is at odds with much of the Bible, and in order to pretend it's not, he has to ignore or downplay much of what's in the Bible. He can do that with the creation stories, and he largely already does, since the Bible has multiple incompatible creation stories, and he ignores parts of them in order to create a harmonized version that isn't what the Bible says anywhere. The fact that other Christians are willing to deprioritize what he wants to prioritize doesn't mean that they're ignoring the Bible any more than he is. It's just that they don't find important what he does. But guess what? Many Christians historically, and at present, disagree with Veith about what's important, all while remaining committed Christians.
Yeah, if you break the confidence right in the beginning, this is just a fallible, made up story or whatever like that. I mean, the main religious entity, I saw a video clip of the Pope one time that was saying he believed in the myth or believed that creation was a myth.
It is. A myth is a story that explains how something came to be or explains the proper relationship between things and features divine agency prominently. It also often involves other fantastical elements such as talking animals. Even if the story is literally true, it's a myth.
And I was like, well, the guy who's touting, or the world is touting as the guy who should be the religious voice in the world, doesn't even believe that creation is real.
The Pope of Rome is the head of one branch of one religion. I don't know why any non-Catholic would think he speaks even for Christianity, never mind religion as a whole. I wouldn't ask the Pope what the Mandaeans think, or what the Baha'i were up to, or what observant Jews should or shouldn't eat, or what incense to burn in a Buddhist temple, or whether or not a shrine to the commie George Washington is appropriate. But further, the fact that a religious leader of the largest single sect of Christianity is okay with evolution should be evidence that Christianity and evolution are not in principle incompatible. And even if they were, that still wouldn't actually be an argument against evolution. It would just mean that any argument for evolution would also be an argument against Christianity, while arguments against evolution are still not actually arguments for Christianity, since there are many options that are neither evolution nor Christianity.
The Big Bang Theory is a Jesuit concept.
Interesting.
No, it's not. The person usually credited with the discovery of the Big Bang is Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest. While he did graduate from 2 Jesuit schools and did consider joining the Society of Jesus, which is the name of the organization to which Jesuits definitionally belong, he instead decided to become a secular or diocesan priest. The only connection between him and the Jesuits beyond just being Catholic was his early education. By that standard, I guess I'm a nun, since in high school there were a couple of nuns that were teaching, and the school was a former convent. Now, do Jesuits accept the Big Bang? I mean, I've never asked any of them, but I assume most of them do. And if they don't, well, that's silly of them. But again, that doesn't make it a Jesuit idea. So there is no legitimate way in which the Big Bang can be called a Jesuit belief or idea.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow is right. Walter just lied to Scotty's face, and he gave no pushback, no skepticism. He just swallowed it. Amazing.
So before we get into this,
it seems like we're already into this, but whatever.
I just have this weird question. You don't have to answer that. But are they blending humans and animals?
Who is blending humans and animals in what way? Also, humans are animals, so it's kind of like asking if someone is blending roses and plants. I have no idea what this could mean, and I bet that means that Walter is going to come up with something completely bonkers.
Are they blending them now?
Yeah.
Genetically?
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of impressed he asked for a clarification.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I saw a video where they were legislating it on a legislative level, and I was like, if they're legislating for that...
You got a citation for that? And no, saying EWTN isn't a citation.
That means they've already done it.
No, it doesn't. There's no reason that someone has to have done something in order for someone to seek to regulate or criminalize that thing. It just has to be foreseeable.
And they were like talking about you can't make more than 50% man and 50% animal. And I was like, wow. Okay, we don't have to get into that unless you want a show about that. Let us know in the comment section below.
Only if it comes with citations. After this, Scotty hands the floor over to Walter Veith, which is odd since I feel like he's had it this whole time. But whatever. I'm not in charge.
Well, why was I an evolutionist in the first place?
Probably one of the reasons anyone is. The evidence or trust in experts.
Same as Richard Dawkins, because of theological concepts that are placed into the minds of young people.
Dawkins is very clear in his many books why he accepts evolution, and it's not theological concepts. It's the overwhelming evidence from fields such as genetics, morphology, embryology, and paleontology. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend his philosophical work, but it's very clear to anyone who has read any of his books about science for laypeople that he has evidentiary, not dogmatic reasons for accepting evolution. Now, we can argue about his reasoning for then going on to reject God, but that's not the same thing. Accepting evolution and rejecting God are not logically required to go together, as we already know from the Pope, who was just mentioned.
My mother was a Lutheran, my father was a Roman Catholic, and the two religions before the 60s were on opposite sides of the pole. And I was taught that my mother, who was very sick, was going to go straight to hell because she didn't have the right religion.
Well, that's really shitty, and I wish that hadn't happened to Walter. No kid deserves to hear that about their parent. I'm not sure what it has to do with evolution, though.
So I was about 10 years or so old at the time, and so I rebelled against this God.
That seems understandable.
In actual fact, I should have rebelled against the teaching and not rebel against the God of the teaching, but I rebelled against that.
I don't understand how that distinction is made. Because there's no obvious physical referent to point to when talking about God, the only referent that can be indicated is the bundle of beliefs about God. Now, I suppose that to some extent that means that every person who believes in God could be said to believe in a different God. I'd be willing to allow that if the conceptual packages that two people use as the referent for God are substantially similar, they have essentially the same God. But despite this, if you rebel against a teaching about God, you are rebelling against the God that those people believe in. I don't know how else it could be. Now, obviously, there is a similar God that Walter does believe in, but then I'm not sure how it could be that he rebelled against the God of Lutheranism, and that led to atheism on its own. His mother was, as he said, Lutheran, and presumably the God of Lutheranism wasn't going to send her to hell, so why not just be a Lutheran? Anyway, today the Catholic Church does not teach that other Christians go straight to hell, and have even started to soften on that in regards to non-Christians, especially those who have not heard the gospel, or who have some impediment to belief. I'm not really here for Catholic theology time, but I just thought that this bit in the story was interesting, and brought up a chance for me to talk about the fact that I think the word God essentially refers to a collection of beliefs, which may or may not be about an external entity that may or may not exist.
And so I would consider myself from probably the age of 10 or 11 as an atheist, not believing in God.
Cool, well, let's skip ahead until we get to some claims about science, or at least until we get to what he says brought him back. I'm not really here for Veith's autobiography.
I taught evolution at the tertiary level at university.
Now, this is important. He was teaching about evolution at the university level, at least according to him. Now, I haven't bothered to verify this, but I'm happy to simply take his word for it. But remember, that means that he had to know what evolution was about and what it wasn't. So if he later gets something very basic about evolution wrong, we know he's lying, not just ignorant. And if he's not lying about evolution and instead is just ignorant, then he must have lied about teaching evolution at a high level.
Did you recognize the inconsistencies then?
I don't even know what Scotty is asking. Which inconsistencies? If it's the inconsistencies within creationism, then yes. If it's the inconsistencies within evolution, I would submit that none have been put forth. But perhaps if that's what he means and Walter answers in the affirmative, then it is in view of inconsistencies to be brought up soon.
No, you would rationalize the inconsistencies. They were there. For example, the whole question of intermediary fossils.
I'm not aware of any question about intermediary fossils as a concept. I guess you could ask about particular ones, like you could wonder about how much time Sahelanthropus chadensis spent in the trees versus Australopithecus africanus versus Homo habilis. But that's not the kind of thing I would expect someone to sum up with a singular phrase, the question about intermediary fossils.
Intermediary fossils not being there.
Ah, well, there's a lie then. Intermediary fossils are all over the place.
You mentioned Stephen Jay Gould earlier in the conversation. Now,
Okay, get ready for a lie about Stephen Jay Gould.
Stephen Jay Gould came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium.
Well, he and Niles Eldredge came up with a hypothesis by that name, one that has largely been falsified, except for the bare fact that relatively long periods of stasis, followed by relatively short periods of somewhat rapid morphological evolution, characterize the pattern of evolution seen in many lineages, at about the genus and species levels.
You always give a fancy name to something.
Yeah, you wanted to sound smart.
Yeah.
So that it sounds good. Now,
Punctuated equilibrium is not really that fancy of a name. Equilibrium means that things are steady and not really changing, except that the equilibrium is punctuated. That means it's not always there, and if something isn't at equilibrium, it's changing. So it's change interspersed with no change. It's about as simple as the name really could be.
basically, punctuated equilibrium was invented because of the lack of intermediary fossils.
Well, at the species level. For example, we're probably not going to find the fossils of the forms that link Canis lupus, the gray wolf, Canis latrans, the coyote, and Canis aureus, the golden jackal, anytime soon. On the other hand, if you want fossils linking, say, canids to ursids or felids, those are easy to find in the form of animals like amphicyonids, Proilurus, and Meiosis.
Darwin said that if intermediary fossils didn't exist, it was a good argument against his theory, and they don't exist.
Are you sure about that?
That's the problem. If they did exist, they wouldn't need punctuated equilibrium.
I guess it's time to tap the Gould quote sign. Quote, "We propose the theory of punctuated equilibrium largely to provide a different explanation of the pervasive trends in the fossil record. Trends, we argued, cannot be attributed to gradual transformation within lineages, but must arise from the different success of certain kinds of species. A trend, we argued, is more like climbing a flight of stairs, punctuated and stasis, than rolling up an inclined plane. Since we propose punctuated equilibria to explain trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but they are abundant between larger groups. Yet a pamphlet entitled Harvard Scientists Agree Evolution is a Hoax states, the facts of punctuated equilibrium which Gould and Eldredge are forcing Darwinists to swallow fit the picture that Brian insisted on and which God has revealed in the Bible, end quote. That's from Gould's essay Evolution as Fact and Theory. So Walter is just lying about the late Stephen Jay Gould. Nice.
So what is punctuated equilibrium? Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there is no gradual evolution that's visible in the fossil record.
At the species level, at least.
So there was a long period of stability, so everything looks the same, and then punctuated. Instantly, you had, because of some environmental circumstance or something, very rapid change.
He's forgetting that this also requires a smaller subset of the population to be isolated, so that effects such as the founder effect and genetic drift can come into play, and also so that the overall rate of molecular evolution can be higher. But hey, who cares about actually portraying ideas that you want to critique accurately, right?
And then back to equilibrium, where nothing changes.
No, it's where there's little to no morphological change. Molecular evolution is always ongoing at the genetic level. It's just that that's not going to fossilize.
So when you look at the fossil record, you don't see any change.
He said while actual images of transitional forms scrolled across the screen. Thanks for doing my job for me, editor of this creationist video.
You just see, okay, here are creatures, but they're fully formed.
I have yet to hear a creationist explain what they mean by fully formed. Evolution doesn't predict that creatures that are transitioning from, say, basal myacid carnivorans to, say, carnivorm carnivorans should go through a stage where they are just a lump of non-differentiated flesh mewling around on the ground. In fact, on the rare occasions when creationists even explain what they would expect a transitional fossil to look like, they describe fairly ordinary organisms that I doubt they themselves would describe as not fully formed. Just saying this means Walter is lying about evolution. He is intentionally strawmanning it. If he taught it, he knows better. If he doesn't know better, then he never taught it.
How did they get there? Well, it was so rapid that the intermediaries got lost in the process.
I guess just not those ones that were on screen, though.
So I went from a fish to a bird immediately.
No. And the fact that he thinks that is at least somewhat down to Walter lying about this. Now, I suspect Walter will in fact disagree with this assessment, as it's probably too blatant even for him to accept this version of punctuated equilibrium.
Well, not quite to the fish to the bird, but let's say it from the fish to the amphibian.
Oh.
He's just lying. He's just f***ing lying. It's at most from the wolf to coyote, or from the lion to the tiger. If you want to see transitionals from fish to amphibian, acknowledging that both of these words are being used ambiguously and in their common and not technical sense, here we go.
Gotcha.
And from the amphibian to the reptile. And from the reptile to the bird. And from the reptile to the mammal, etc.
Wow, look at that. We have transitional species for exactly the thing Walter was lying about. How shocking.
Now, being a comparative physiologist, of course, you also look at not only the anatomy of these creatures, but you look at the physiology of these creatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, that's true. But to pivot back to what he was saying, it's amazing to me that no one here even asks if there are any transitionals that have been put forth. They all just swallow this bukkake of lies like they're drunk at a party in college for the first time, and they can finally experiment without their strict parents cutting them off. Does the panel have absolutely no curiosity, no critical thinking skills, no sense of the need to not simply take any old asshole's word for it when he says things they like? Have none of them ever learned how to check for legitimate sources, or even just how to think logically? Honestly, this is tragic. To think that humans can be so horrible at the one thing humans are supposed to be exceptional at: thinking. You know, in a lot of versions of Christianity, the Imago Dei, or image of God, spoken about in Genesis, is less about humans physically look like God, and more about them sharing in his moral, rational, and creative capacities. If that's true, then these 4 humans are doing more to deface the Imago Dei than I think any atheist could possibly do. If God is real and humans are actually made in his image, I can't help but think that he must be weeping over these 4.
And the anatomy often dictates the physiology.
Mm-hmm.
Physiology is a study of how anatomy interacts in the functioning of an organism. It's basically always dictated by anatomy. It couldn't really be any other way.
And you can't just change the anatomy without changing the physiology.
Again, yeah, that's true, but then minor changes in anatomy cause minor and automatic changes in physiology. For example, if a mutation causes the digestive system to add an outgrowth, that'll change how digestion works. And we can see such things in ruminants, animals like deer, bison, giraffes, and pronghorn. But if the outgrowth, say, starts to increase the permeability of the membranes to oxygen, then it's a supplement to the respiratory system. That's a change to physiology. Then if it starts to increase oxygen intake and decrease digestive functioning, now it's starting to be a lung, which is a change to the anatomy and physiology. That's the very thing evolution is about.
So it gets very tricky.
I fail to see how.
Because there are whole enzyme structures, whole genetic sequences that have to change. When you change an anatomical sequence, you also have to change the metabolic sequence. For example, how do you go from a cold-blooded creature to a warm-blooded creature without changing the metabolism?
Well, you don't, but that's what being warm-blooded versus cold-blooded is. It's like saying you don't grow taller without lengthening your bones. Yeah, obviously. So metabolism at its most basic is essentially just a really slow fire. Organisms take in chemicals, break them apart, extract energy to power their own biological processes, and then the excess energy is released as heat, and there are waste products in the form of oxidized chemicals like CO2. At least that's how it is for aerobic respiration, and since there are no warm-blooded creatures that rely on anaerobic respiration, I'm going to ignore it for now. Essentially, being warm-blooded is just being able to do this metabolic slow burn fast enough that the organism can counter the loss of this waste heat to the environment, keeping itself warmer than its surroundings. It then usually will also have mechanisms to cool it off, but those are common to cold-blooded creatures as well. So yes, you need to change the metabolism in that you need to speed it up. But it does not need to fundamentally change. You don't need new enzymes or biochemical pathways. You just need to be more active with the ones you've got. Now, that's not to say that warm-blooded creatures won't evolve new metabolic processes, just that it's not core to becoming warm-blooded in the first place. There is no enzymatic or physiological barrier to the evolution of active thermoregulation that can keep an animal warm despite the outside temperature. But Walter knows that he can use a bunch of words that the idiots he's talking to don't know, and thus both sound smart and pretend to have proposed a problem for evolution.
Right.
All of these things must sort of develop simultaneously, and it's very, very complex.
Well, good thing that evolution is a process in which anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry change gradually from one generation to the next with incremental steps, and that multiple aspects of an organism can evolve in parallel, so it doesn't have to grow wings and then wait around for a high enough metabolic rate to actually be able to fly with them. Instead, things like aerodynamic capability and metabolic rate can evolve in tandem. It's almost like this isn't a problem in the least for evolution, and only by being ignorant or a liar could someone say it is. And since Walter apparently taught this stuff, I guess he's a liar.
But that's all you have.
If you know what the antecedent to the relative pronoun that is in the sentence he just uttered, please let me know in the comments. I can't figure it out.
So let's say you start off as a gradualist. That's Darwinism.
The thing is, the punctuated equilibrium is also gradualistic on human timescales. It doesn't involve hopeful monsters where a Tyrannosaurus lays an egg and out pops a bird. It would still take hundreds or thousands of generations to go from a coyote to a jackal, but creationists like to pretend otherwise in order to make punctuated equilibrium more or less the same as the old idea of saltationism, which did in fact propose that macromutations could cause huge morphological shifts in a single generation. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself. Walter hasn't actually done that yet, so let's give him a chance, even though based on his previous behavior, we have no reason to do so.
gradual change over long periods of time. That's called the gradualist. Mm-hmm. And then you don't find the change happening in the fossil record, so you are compelled to become a punctuated equilibriumist.
No, you're not, because punctuated equilibrium is about a lot more than just the pace of morphological evolution. That's the part of it that has survived, but it's also the most trivial part. The actual meaty parts, such as group selection, have just not panned out and are not accepted by the scientific community. Plus, he's depicting this as a dichotomy, but it actually exists on a continuum. In some cases, like the genera Triceratops, Thalassocnus, and Homo, we actually have so many specimens that we can watch the transition from one species to the next through time, just as the extreme form of gradualism would predict. But for most other genera, like Panthera or Canis or Australopithecus, we can't do that, and instead is closer to what one might expect from the staccato evolution associated with punctuated equilibrium. But there are also cases in between. These are not ideas in opposition to each other. You don't have to choose one and reject the other any more than you have to choose to drive either 25 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour. In fact, you can drive at many speeds between those. Which
is a Stephen Jay Gould follower.
No, it's not, because science doesn't work like a revealed religion with prophets. Science doesn't have prophets, gurus, or sages. It has pioneers. But the only reason to follow what a pioneer says is if they're right. Gould wasn't right about most of the things he proposed, but he was right that the pace of evolution varies. That's why evolutionary biologists accept that, but don't accept most of the rest of the stuff he said. The same is true for Darwin. He was right about natural and sexual selection, but he was wrong about a bunch of other stuff. Stuff no scientists take seriously now, like blended inheritance via gemmules shed by the tissues of the body.
And you have these two schools of thought, and they're always at loggerheads with each other.
Wrong.
But you really have no option. You have to go that route.
What route? What does that even mean?
Mm-hmm. And they don't know, they can't identify what's causing the punctuation. They just know it's happening, or they believe it's happening.
Of course they can. It's fairly easy if you know the basics of evolutionary biology. In large populations, evolution acts slowly as it takes a longer time for mutations to spread. Also, because the larger the population, the more sensitive natural selection is, a large population will tend to be optimally suited for its environment. That is, it will occupy a peak on the fitness landscape, and provided that the environment does not change much, any significant morphological change will of necessity lower the fitness of the individual, and with the very high sensitivity of natural selection, such variations will not persist long at all. Therefore, a large population in a static environment is predicted to arrive at a morphological and physiological optimum, and then just stay there. But if part of the population wanders into a new area and is cut off, and the new area has a different environment, then suddenly evolution can happen more rapidly in the smaller population. Natural selection will favor a different morphology and physiology, and the founder effect will mean that both neutral and non-neutral variation is not at the same frequency as in the original population. All of this adds up to rapid morphological change. If the new smaller changed population is able to go back into the environment of the original population and thrive, then in the fossil record it will look like one species was there all along, and then suddenly a very similar but distinct species appears. That really is like high school level evolutionary biology.
Oh, they'll say there was a rapid environmental change.
That's actually more likely to result in either extinction or more gradualistic evolution if the period of the environmental change is actually recorded in the fossil record. But it could also just result in the appearance of an entirely new species if the rapid change is not recorded.
Global warming could do it, you know what I mean?
I see.
Why deny one part of science when you can deny basically all of it, right? But also, yes, global warming is already resulting in extinctions and will result in rapid evolution in those species that manage to cling on through it.
You know, I did these things come up, Christianity, in the conversation, and does the whole group just be like, no, be quiet, we're not going to even
And then
talk
why discredit?
I don't see why it would. Science isn't what is in opposition to Christianity. It's just following the evidence. What the Bible says is completely irrelevant, as are the religious beliefs and practices of anyone doing science, provided that they don't bias their data gathering or interpretation based on those beliefs and practices. The proper amount to talk about Christianity, or any other religion for that matter, in a biology class is none.
And then why discredit things like the flood, you know, that punctuated event?
Well, if every proposed flood model weren't physically impossible, and if the sedimentary rocks of the Phanerozoic didn't include many layers that were definitely not laid down by a flood, then I'm sure it would come up. But as it is, it's as valid a thing to discuss in a science classroom as the flat Earth. In other words, the only reason to talk about it is as something we now know to be wrong, but the people used to think was true, and that a few nutters still think is true. despite all the conclusive evidence to the contrary.
We'll talk about everything like with the planet was seeded by animal or aliens and all sorts of stuff like this. Like we'll entertain some pretty wild things, but not Christianity. Nope.
I'm not aware of any actual widespread acceptance of panspermia in biology, but it has the advantage of being consistent with physical laws as we know them. God is not, basically by definition, which means that while panspermia is an idea open to scientific inquiry, God magic is not. Further, young Earth creationism, to the extent that it is actually open to scientific inquiry, has failed every single test. We know it's wrong. Now, I don't conflate that with Christianity, but it seems that Scotty here does. I think that's a bad move on his part, but technically, it's none of my business.
Leave that off the table.
Oh, they actually do entertain alien, but not in the sense of alien beings.
I'm not sure where he's going here. Alien beings are certainly at least a possible vector for the interstellar spread of biology.
Although the metaphysical world will go there and say that alien beings interfered in the evolution of humanity.
I guess the History Channel has been rebranded to the Metaphysical World. Probably a better name for them.
They made the punctual something.
But
they had a machine.
Let's leave that out.
Yes, let's. Just like basically all of the scientific community, for whom it's just a fun thought experiment and not an actual serious consideration, since it makes very few, if any, testable predictions, all while being at least physically possible, unlike most of young Earth creationism.
They will have a theory that if it didn't happen here because it couldn't happen here, it must have happened elsewhere.
I mean, that does not seem to logically follow. There was a time when there was no life on Earth, and now there is. Something changed that. If it didn't change by life coming about on Earth, there aren't many other options than life came about elsewhere. But origin of life researchers are not exactly despairing of the possibility that life started on Earth, so this whole topic is mostly irrelevant to anything going on in science.
And that theory is called panspermia.
Interesting.
It's not a theory, it's not even really a hypothesis. It's just a thought some people have had, and it's not logically or physically impossible that we know of.
Panspermia, so it was spermed from out of space.
Did he just use sperm as a verb? I do not like that at all. Let me know in the comments if you also heard him say spermed like it's a weak verb, or if it was just me.
So you can't get a molecule to form naturalistically, so it must have happened out of space where there were different conditions. You don't exactly know how.
You can't prove it.
And I came here via a meteor, and boom, then they were there and they could be incorporated. That's how it works.
Yeah, a few things. Scientists know of plausible naturalistic mechanisms to get lipids, amino acids, sugars, and various polymers of more than one kind, all in ways that are relevant to prebiotic Earth. But we have also detected complex chemicals in space, including sugars and alcohols. So we don't need space for abiogenesis, but even so, it looks like important aspects of prebiotic chemistry happens there too, resulting in not a problem for the origin of life, but us being spoiled for options.
Yeah, that's the irritating part. There's a lot of stuff that can't be proven, which science is supposed to be about proving duplicatable experimentation, right? And so much of this is not.
Yeah, and on that list are supernatural events of any kind, a worldwide flood, separate ancestry, all animals originating in the Middle East, etc. None of those things can be verified or repeated, and most of them we know couldn't possibly have happened. That pot really does seem fixated on calling the kettle black, even though the kettle is really a teal color that's slightly discolored at the bottom because of scorch marks. And now I realize I kind of miss my old kettle. Aw, now I'm sad. Oh well.
Yes, so you have to have these prop theories in order to explain what's inexplicable.
Yeah, see, that criticism only works if panspermia is actually a mainstream or even consensus idea about the origin of life. But it's not. It isn't really being seriously investigated. It isn't talked about in general by origin of life researchers. In fact, creationists talk about it more than I've ever heard actual scientists talk about it.
And here's what's crazy is it's like, they're so not willing to just say, hey, look, Christianity to me makes a lot of sense when you listen to it.
A lot of biologists are and have been Christians, so yes, they are. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists there is after Darwin, was himself an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Joel Duff, an evolutionary biologist, fellow counter-creationist, science friend, and friend of the channel, is a Christian. Bob Bacher of paleontological fame is also a Christian preacher. Francis Collins, a medical professional and man who accepts evolution, is also famously Christian. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the person who first found soft tissue remains in a T-Rex femur, is a Christian who is very open about how she loves the Lord. Nothing about evolution precludes Christianity, even if it precludes Scotty's version.
At least everybody needs to be honest and come to the point and say that they're both approaching their worldview by faith.
Yeah.
Nope. I don't see what about science requires faith. That just sounds like he's trying to put his faith on par with evidence-based empirical knowledge, which it's absolutely not. Look, things aren't wrong because they're believed by faith. But nothing in science needs to be believed by faith. There is ample evidence for any of the firm conclusions of science to negate the need for faith.
Yeah.
Well, I came to that conclusion because when I was eventually confronted with certain things in the scriptures which were irrefutable.
I would love to know what those things are, maybe just unfalsifiable claims.
Because there are things in scripture which are irrefutable.
Give an example.
Hey, thanks, Scotty. That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Daniel.
Prophecy.
Yeah, prophecy.
Daniel. Yeah. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9.
Fun thing about Daniel, it stops being accurate after a certain point. It's almost like it wasn't written at the time of the events depicted, and the so-called prophecies were actually written ex post facto, and once they catch up to the writer's present, they suddenly become inaccurate. That's the obvious explanation. Now, I can't say for certain that God didn't actually inspire it with a fun little mix of accurate and inaccurate so-called prophecies that become inaccurate in a temporally dependent way, exactly as if it had been written by just some guy wanting some apocalyptic literature to encourage his fellow Jews. Or maybe it just was written by some guy wanting some apocalyptic literature to encourage his fellow Jews. Either way, the argument only works if you assume that Daniel was written at the time the text depicts, and that it's inspired. You could just not do that, since there's no reason to do that unless you just assume the Bible is the inspired word of God. So no, this isn't irrefutable or a valid argument. It's just circular, and that's not even me saying Daniel isn't inspired. That's not my job. I'm just pointing out that this argument isn't it.
You mentioned the civilizations. There's no way around that. There is no way you can.
You can say it must have been written after the fact.
There's every indication that it was, so yeah, you can just say that.
But archaeology disproves that.
Really? Does that mean that we have any archaeological evidence, like a manuscript of the prophecies of Daniel dating to before the events that Daniel gets right? Because if so, that's the first I've heard of it, and I would love a citation, because hey, if that's true, I will change my mind about Daniel right quick. Somehow, though, I suspect there is no such archaeological find.
For a scroll.
I have listened to this audio like 8 times, and I can't figure out what the word is before the word scroll. I would love to know, because that might actually be the citation that's needed, but oh well.
Yeah.
So eventually you get to the point, all right, this is irrefutable. Now, is that the only thing that's irrefutable, or?
I'd love to get to that point, but just saying the word archaeology isn't really going to cut it. Of course, it's also the case that even if Daniel were full of real inspired prophecy, that doesn't actually make the primeval history of Genesis true. The truth of that history and the accuracy of Daniel are separate claims that must be assessed and substantiated separately.
You know how irrefutable is the rest of the story then? Does it dovetail in?
Well, since I haven't been given any reason to think it's irrefutable, or even just not yet refuted, I don't think we can say that it's the only such thing, if it's such a thing in the first place. But hey, maybe Walt will do better with his second example.
So my first confrontation, I would say, was prophecy, which I really tried to negate. I went to every library under the sun, to the theological schools. I really tried to prove that this was written after the fact or whatever, and I came up against a brick wall.
Given that it's the overwhelming consensus among both believing and non-believing biblical scholars that Daniel's prophecies that are accurate are ex post facto, I have trouble believing he wasn't able to find any evidence. Of course, this also contradicts the actual story of his conversion experiences, so I'm calling bullshit on this whole story. I can't say for a fact, but I do not think he researched this at all until after converting to Seventh-day Adventism, and that then his research was either all or primarily based on Adventist sources.
You're bringing up a really good point. A lot of people like to throw things out and not do the investigation.
Exactly, hence why Veith has thrown out all the investigation done by experts over decades that all has come to one conclusion. Daniel is post-exilic, and the prophecy is largely ex post facto. Remember, if someone tells you they found no evidence for the consensus scholarly view, they're lying. Now, that's not the same as someone telling you they disagree with the consensus. Lots of people do that, and for good reason, and sometimes they're right. But the consensus view in fields like history, archaeology, biblical studies, etc., are formed because the weight of the evidence has convinced the majority of scholars in that field of a single answer to a question. The scholarly consensus on Daniel wouldn't be what it is if there weren't evidence. So when Walt says he couldn't find it, he's lying, either about looking or about not finding it. At best, he went looking exclusively in non-scholarly sources.
Go look it up. Like you've got such a hard stance about this or that, and you never looked at the information.
This might be the hardest projection I've ever seen. This is like lighthouse level projection. And remember, these are the guys who in the last video said that they didn't know about the subjects this episode of their show was about.
Yeah, and I'm curious, why? Why did you not want to change?
He already told us he was resentful about the Catholic doctrine of ex ecclesiam nulla salus, or outside the church none are saved, as it was interpreted when his mother died.
Well, I had such a terrible concept of God that God didn't exist.
Exactly, he didn't want to believe in God since he'd been told God sent his mother to hell. He'd rather believe in no God than God. That seems pretty reasonable to me.
I mean, I was confronted as a lecturer when I was giving lectures at the university, even at first year level, and sometimes at postgraduate level, by students that were religious. I would blast them off the planet because that is such a ridiculous notion.
Well, first, it seems like Veith was a horrible teacher. I'm glad that as time went, his teaching duties were reduced. Students shouldn't be blasted, as he says, for their religious beliefs, and only those that are actually at odds with material need even be discussed at all. And trust me, God's existence isn't such a belief. If you are enrolled in a college or university and any of your instructors start denigrating a student on the grounds of their religious affiliation, including yourself, you should absolutely report that behavior. It's not acceptable, and this is a violation of the ethical codes of basically every secular school, at least that I know of. Now, of course, if you decide to go to Brigham Young University, Bob Jones University, or Loma Linda University, well, you probably know what you're getting into, and that's a different story. Also, I don't recommend going to those.
How dare you confront this God called science?
That's kind of what students are supposed to do, confront new information and learn how to think about it, and how the people who claim it's true got to that point. If Walter thinks that the proper role of an instructor is to simply dump knowledge into students' brains, like he's dumping his torrented anime collection into his external hard drive, then he was a bad instructor. Now, that's not to say that an instructor should leave bad ideas unchallenged, but the challenge cannot be in the form of an incredulous or scandalized scolding or rebuke. But okay, they just keep going on about how shit of a teacher Walt must have been without ever really calling him out on it. So let's tune back in when we have more actual claims rather than Walt just revealing what a piece of crap he is. He just tells a story about making the student cry, and then a story I don't really believe about people getting angry at him for putting up questions about evolution for discussion. Of course, he then resigned of his own free will, and this was after he had become a science denier.
I thought, as I'm reading through the creation account, God spoke, and then we had the creation week, but I thought every day was like a millennia.
Yeah.
What Kendi is describing is day-age creationism. It's an attempt to reconcile the obviously ancient age of the Earth with the creation narrative in Genesis 1. I think it pretty obviously isn't what the author of Genesis 1 had in mind, but it's at least an attempt to take into account the evidence of the world around us. So it's got a leg up on young Earth creationism. Now, she did say millennium, which is a bit short, but I don't think she was being super careful with her word choice.
So embedded within God creating, it just took a while for each thing to grow and for the water to rise up. And so that's how I rationalized the two ideas.
There are still some major problems with the order of creation, though, which is one of the big reasons day-age creationism is not really very popular.
It was only till later that I realized that I was taught that even believing that, even blending those two ideas is still anti the Bible, anti who God is, because God speaks and things happen.
I don't follow. Why does God speaking preclude that the things he caused could unfold in some amount of time? I always imagine things like that taking at least some time. Maybe there's some aspect of Adventist doctrine or something that I'm missing, except I'm not actually sure that this show is an Adventist thing. Yep, I double-checked. They're connected to or owned by Heritage and Hope Ministries, which was itself founded by two Adventist brothers, and it specifically exists to promote Adventist beliefs.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's questioning the authority and power of God to blend the two.
I really don't see how, unless, of course, in her mind, the interpretive framework she gets from her church is what she thinks the authority of God is. In that case, why bother with even caring what the Bible says? If the authority is the traditions of your sect, then it doesn't matter what's in the Bible.
They don't mix. These two ideologies cannot mix.
They actually negate each other.
Yes, that's true.
Well, first, science isn't an ideology. It's a method of investigating the natural world through means of empiricism and hypothesis testing. Second, you can be a Christian who doesn't reject science. People do it all the time.
And the spirit behind the evolutionary mindset, as you were talking about, the rage and the...
Do I seem full of rage? Let me know in the comments.
Not wanting to delve into the information to see, to dig deeper and to see why there are these inconsistencies and actually finding the answers that the Bible displays. It's that spirit that we know who it comes from.
They keep saying there are inconsistencies, but so far none have been put forth. Also, we're back to Satan being in charge of, well, I guess everyone accepting reality for what it is? Well done, Satan, if that's what you're up to.
Yeah, because isn't that the scientific way? You have a problem, you lay out all the things on the table, and you try to find out the problem?
Yeah.
No, that sounds more like engineering or troubleshooting. Science starts with questions, not really problems, although the question may have been brought up because of a problem.
You test all the different avenues because you want to make sure that the one that you're going with is the right, most tried and true tested thing. Wouldn't you want to test them all?
Yes, that's why there are numerous experiments going on in evolutionary biology all the time, even this minute. Two of the most famous being the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment and the Luria-Delbruck experiment. But there have also been tests showing multiple paths from unicellularity to multicellularity, the heritability of evolvability, convergent evolution, etc. Science is indeed doing all the tests scientists can think of in evolution. If Keith actually has some novel test he'd like to propose, he should bring it up to some scientists. But he should also be prepared for his test to be useless or already done, since he doesn't know enough about the field to know what it predicts and what research is being and has been done.
I wondered, though, in that how big of a community that may be, where there are evolutionists who still have a level of respect for different things within the Bible. They may not take the whole Bible or take Christianity altogether, but they would respect prophecies or like different aspects of it. Is that the case? Or it's a hard line, complete evolutionists and then Christian?
No, you get a category of people that are called theistic evolutionists. They blend the two concepts.
Yep, you sure do. And I don't really care about Walt's take on Christians who aren't science deniers, because we all know he'll just say that they're compromisers or the like. Let's skip again until something actually worth responding to comes up. The only vaguely interesting thing he says is that death is essential for evolution. It's technically not, but evolution certainly accounts for a lot of death, and there was a lot of death in the history of life on Earth.
Yeah, I remember thinking how evolution was very selfish.
That makes as much sense as saying that gravity is melancholy. Evolution is a natural process. It doesn't have motives, emotions, or thoughts. It doesn't make choices. We sometimes use anthropomorphic language to describe it, but those are analogies that make it easier to talk about evolution, not actual reflections of the reality of the situation. Something I think most people understand, although with young Earth creationists, you can never be sure.
It's all about self-preservation, right? So the only way you're propagating your own gene pool is due to selfishness. You want to survive. You want your own to survive. And so...
In fact, no. In fact, the evolution of altruism is addressed in evolutionary biology, and natural selection does not lead to extreme selfishness of necessity, although I guess it could. The most obvious avenue for the evolution of altruism is kin selection. You share about half of your autosomal DNA with your children and about a quarter with your cousins and nieces and nephews. That means that if you have a bunch of any of those relatives, their survival is about as good as your survival in terms of the continuation of your genetic material. And if there is a large number of such relatives out there, they will likely have more reproductive opportunities than you will on your own. And presuming they're of both sexes, they'll also have a wider pool of reproductive partners as a whole than you will as a single individual. This means that natural selection will favor you protecting them or providing for them, even at your own detriment, provided you can reliably determine who is related to you. In humans, this is done by their big brain remembering who gave birth to whom and all that stuff. For ants and bees, it's done by scent. The gals that smell enough like you are your sisters. The fact that humans use their weirdly malleable brains for tracking altruism is probably also what allows them to expand this altruistic impulse to other conspecifics and even members of other species, as sort of a byproduct of kin selection. So no, evolution doesn't result in selfishness in all cases.
it's void of love. Though I've seen some articles that try to massage that a bit of like, well, the reason you have emotions is that you can care about your offspring. And
You mean the offspring who carry your genetics? Seems like a pretty strong selection pressure there. Also, I'm not sure I'd say that's the reason emotions exist at all, but it's probably a big part of the emotions like love.
and so that you can propagate your gene pool. But still, it's not the same as you love them because you just love them and care about them. It doesn't exist very well in that ecosystem.
Ah, so because Keith doesn't like the reason evolution gives for the existence of things like kindness and love, therefore it's wrong. Got it. Credo consolens the whole way through. On a side note, if I just keep increasing the proportion of these videos in Lingua Latinum, would y'all just naturally start knowing more Latin?
It's all very self-driven.
He said after himself pointing out that that's not what's in literature, and without a hint of irony.
Yeah, and then how are you ever going to be so opposite than others focused?
I heard him say, yeah, and then how are you ever going to be that it's so opposite than others focused? That's not a real sentence. But I'm going to meet him halfway. I think it can be reasonably interpreted as him complaining that evolution is not other-centered. Which, okay, reality has no obligation to arrange itself in the way Scotty wants it to. No one is asking Scotty to be enthusiastic about evolution or to love it. I just want him to stop denying science.
You know, the whole Bible is really about loving, God with all your heart and doing what he says. And then also, loving your fellow man. It's like survival of the fittest is just literally like, I got to get mine before you got to get yours. That's the mentality.
Except that it's not, at least not always, and certainly not in the case of humans.
And it works its way into Hollywood. Some of the things that we talk about. You look at the poster for X-Men Apocalypse, it says, only the strong will survive.
Yeah, that's the ideology of Apocalypse. The bad guy? The guy you're not supposed to root for? Does Keith think that the guy in the ominous black armor crushing a human skull on the movie poster is the good guy?
That's evolution right there.
No, it's not, because physical strength does not always correlate with fitness in evolutionary biology. This is something that comes up a lot in anti-evolution circles. The equation of fitness in evolutionary biology with fitness in the sense of what you hope to improve on in a gym. Fitness in evolution is all about reproductive success. It's pretty easy to come up with a scenario in which strength would be selected against. Suppose you find yourself on an island where there are few, if any, predators, but also very little food. In such a scenario, the energetic costs of being strong and having big muscles may be very high, with very little benefit, whereas those with less muscle can spend more of their time getting it on with conspecifics than on eating to maintain superfluous muscle mass. In such a case, the weak will survive. This is basically what happens with flightless island birds. Having strong enough wings to fly is great, but only if flight is important to your survival. If it's not, then actually having weak wings is better for your reproductive success, and hence doves turn into dodos and parrots into kakapos, flightless versions of their flighted continental relatives.
Yeah, that's how it is actually affecting our pop culture today.
So evolution is affecting our pop culture by making people root against the guy who thinks that might makes right? Well, fun fact, the Bible is also full of stories about might being used unjustly and God not liking that. So it seems like that would also be how the Bible might influence pop culture. But also, there's really no significant way in which evolution is the cause of stories like those in X-Men Apocalypse. The problem of tyrants and how to deal with them is the basis for stories that go all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which starts with Gilgamesh being a cruel tyrant and his people crying out to the gods to save them from him. The theme of tyrants who are themselves strong men who need to be overthrown is basically the oldest theme in storytelling we have written record of. So no, this isn't because of evolution.
It not only affects that, it affects everything. It affects our medical world, for example.
That's true. Much of modern medicine is dependent on our understanding of evolution. It's an important part of research into new vaccines and antibiotics.
Because if everything is evolutionary, then everything is interconnected. That means that DNA happened by chance, which gives you the right to manipulate it as you want to.
What the hell is he talking about? That doesn't follow in the least. That something is random doesn't give you any right over it. And it's not like doctors are going around injecting their patients with DNA treatments against their will, at least not in countries with medical ethics. Real doctors aren't Fabius Bile, the primogenitor, chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, Traitor Astartes.
Whereas if you were created in the image of God, then your DNA is pretty kind-orientated.
Yeah.
Kind-orientated? What the holy hell does that mean?
And the thinking pattern behind behind it gives you the right to do certain things which otherwise would be considered highly unethical.
Any examples of that? Because, of course, even if all that were true, which it's not, it would just be an argument from consequences. Even if evolution being true had bad consequences, that doesn't make it not true. If someone tells me my house is on fire, not believing them on the grounds that if they're right, it would suck is illogical. No matter how much it would suck for my house to be on fire, that it would suck has no bearing on if it is, in fact, on fire.
Which is where they are wanting this to go. I know this conversation is not necessarily about transhuman or where they're actually pushing this thing, but yes, you disregard God in that equation, and it's like, why couldn't you edit your genes? Why couldn't you GMO people? Why
can't we improve upon them?
Why couldn't you do that with God? Look, if the principle is that everything about how you are, without medical intervention, is how God wants you to be, then we shouldn't have medical interventions at all. But I noticed that among the 4 people here, all have corrective eyeglasses. Is it immoral in taking the prerogative of God to correct the vision of the majority of the panel? I suspect that they would say no. But let's say that all their vision problems are ultimately caused by genetics, which is likely not the case, but we're just doing it for the sake of the thought experiment. Why is it okay to correct the effects of a genetic trait, but not the genetics of it? What fundamental moral difference is there between someone overcoming their natural genetics through an eyeglass, or a pill to manage a chemical imbalance, or a surgery to fix a physical deformity, and using a genetics treatment to do the same? Is there some inherent holiness in genetic diseases? That seems like a weird stance to take that's not anywhere in the Bible. And further, I can't imagine why anyone would think that evolution would give more or less license for genetic therapies than if it were not true.
That's right. Why couldn't you add the technology into the body that would, allow you to live forever with no consequences?
He said while wearing eyeglasses like a hypocrite. Really think about this. This is a group of 4 people complaining about using technology as a medical intervention to improve the lives of humans, while themselves all requiring technology as a medical intervention to improve their lives. If they want to make this argument, they better do it after having thrown out their glasses, reset their teeth to how they were before braces, and if any of them ever had life-saving surgery or a pacemaker or anything like that, they frankly should be in the ground before they can have this conversation. Not only is this absurdly hypocritical, but it's also insanely cruel. For people who are just sitting around complaining about evolution not being kind enough or not leading to enough kindness to advocate against technological interventions to alleviate suffering is just wild.
You said you didn't want to go there, but I have a question. And excuse my ignorance, but I'm wondering how much truth is within evolution as sin entered into the world.
Like, did evolution become more true after the fall? Is that her question?
Because can a human set something in motion, so to speak, where the concept of evolution plays out?
Yes, very much so. This has happened more times than I can even count and has been published on many times. You can find lots of examples of humans setting up experiments in evolution and then watching the evolution happen in real time, including in the wild, in labs, and in simulations.
When we read in the Bible the story with the antediluvians at the Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel comes after, not before the flood. She's worse at this than Bodhi Hodge is, and that's saying something.
God put a stop to it because of what they were capable of.
Yep, the story portrays God as being threatened by the power of the humans.
So does evolution have its place in this sinful world, and it didn't have its place during what God created and what God is seeking to restore?
I actually don't know how Walter will respond to that, because clearly most creationists actually accept a lot of evolution because things like natural selection are so obviously true, and they rely on evolution to make the size of Noah's Ark work in terms of bringing enough animals on board. But on the other hand, I don't think he wants to allow even a single foot in the door when it comes to evolution and giving it support.
Well, it gets rather complicated when you think about all of those genetic implications. I mean, why is there genetic degeneration in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't. We don't have any evidence to say that the genetics of humans are getting worse. In fact, that the human population is going up means that it cannot be getting worse in evolutionary terms. And we have evidence of genetic diseases going way back. So the premise is just false, and it's also not responsive to Kendi's question, which is going to be kind of a theme with her questions and Walter's responses.
Does there have to be genetic degeneration?
Well, since it isn't in any way meaningful to evolution, I guess not, no.
Why is it, for example, that generative cells, like ova or sperm cells, have the capacity to remain in a juvenile form, even if the rest of the cells are aging?
I mean, the answer is going to have to do with things like the biochemistry and telomeres of the cells and such, but I don't see why the answer depends on evolution being correct or special creation being correct. Like, does he think the answer is magic? If we come to the conclusion that God made it that way, how does that suggest new research? What data can we predict on that basis?
I mean, an
That's
80-year-old man has perfectly virile spermatozoa that can produce perfectly virile offspring, etc.
Not entirely. Human males do in fact have decreased fertility late in life, and the children they have a higher rate of complications and birth defects. Now, an 80-year-old man can have a perfectly healthy baby, but they're much less likely to, all things held equal, than a 25-year-old man.
Interesting.
So what is the limiting factor? And that is the research that is going on, but we're going way into another direction here.
Who's doing this research? Because it's certainly not young Earth creationists.
Totally are.
But the elixir of life, how can you restore all of that? And what happened at the Tower of Babel? You were asking that.
Now we're on to the Tower of Babel? I am a little lost.
I think it's good that we don't completely, categorize people as one way or the other.
Is Keith coming out in support of non-binary and intersex people? Good for him if he is. But I have this sinking feeling right around my pyloric sphincter that he's not doing that.
I read a book on CRISPR. And it was just kind of coming on the scene when I was graduating. And CRISPR is this DNA gene editing technique. It's like word processing for your genome.
Weird way to put it, but okay.
But the people that were developing it actually called for a moratorium on it until there were ethical guardrails put in place. And I don't know if they were Christian. I don't know if they were evolutionists.
I bet some of them were and some of them weren't. You don't need to be a Christian to have ethical concerns about biotechnology, and you don't have to abandon your Christianity to accept biology. Also, if by evolutionist he means someone who accepts science, that's not something one can put in opposition to being a Christian. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists there is after Darwin, was himself an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Joel Duff, an evolutionary biologist, fellow counter-creationist, science friend, and friend of the channel, is a Christian. Bob Bacher of paleontological fame is also a Christian preacher. Francis Collins, a medical professional and man who accepts evolution, is also famously Christian. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the person who first found soft tissue remains in a T-Rex femur, is a Christian who is very open about how she loves the Lord.
But there was a team of scientists that were calling for it. So I'm guessing there's a team of scientists. There's probably some evolutionists there.
Well, since evolution is the core unifying theory in biology, and since there is essentially no more dissent in the scientific community about evolution than there is in the shape of the Earth, I'm going to say that they were all people who don't reject science, which is essentially what Keith means by evolutionist.
And still calling for that moratorium because they saw, the implications. Even not being Christians, they, likely saw the implications that, hey, we shouldn't just tinker with this to no end or open the box.
In today's show, Keith finds out that people have a sense of morality and ethical duty regardless of their opinion on Jesus. Watch tomorrow as he finds out that non-Christians are generally also not eating babies and even volunteer at soup kitchens and shelters. Further, talking like this just encourages the conflation between good and Christian, but historically Christians have often not been anything you could call good. There is a millennia-long history of absolutely heinous acts either motivated by Christianity or that have used it as an excuse or a mix of both. Indeed, that's still happening in places. Christians are not inherently good. Christianity is not an unambiguously good thing, and non-Christians are not inherently of lesser moral character, nor are non-Christian ideologies unambiguously bad for not being Christian. Christians can be paragons of virtue, and they can be despicable monsters, just like everyone else. But I think I've said all I want to about bioethics. Let's wait until more actual science stuff is talked about.
When you look at the genetic system, you have a lot of, well, the majority of the genes where they didn't know what their function was.
Nope. If it's a gene, then its function is to code for a protein. That's just what genes are, sections of the genome that code for proteins. Walter has to know this.
They were sort of considered as relics of the evolutionary process.
I'm not sure what it means for genes to be relics of evolution. They're genes. All genes got here through evolution. I know he's trying to make a junk DNA argument, but he's doing it in such a confusing manner. This from a guy who claims to have taught evolution at a high level.
You don't need that.
You don't need that. You don't need this. And you only use X amount of your genetic system. The rest is redundant.
Well, if it's actually a gene, then more likely than not, you do need it, as genes that aren't needed tend to turn into pseudogenes. In fact, humans have many pseudogenes. Most famously, the gulo pseudogene is homologous to the gene that in most mammals makes a protein that allows for vitamin C synthesis. Humans, along with other primates, have a breakage in this gene that means that they will get scurvy if they don't eat enough vitamin C, because they can't synthesize their own. Your pet cat or dog can't get scurvy, but a gorilla or a baboon sure can. However, the vast majority of your genome is not made up of genes. Some of it is, and some of the rest is regulatory regions that help control those genes, but most of it is in fact junk. And we can test this. First, homologous sections can be completely deleted from mouse genomes, and the resultant mice are perfectly healthy and fertile. And their offspring are healthy and fertile as well, meaning that those parts of the genome really are not needed. Further, we can check for selection. If a section of the genome is accumulating mutations at more or less the background rate, then it's not under any purifying selection, and it's not sequence constrained. That means that for the organism, it doesn't really matter what's in that bit of DNA. This is positive evidence for lack of function, not just function being assumed to be absent because the function is unknown.
Now, that kind of thinking has slowly been eroded over time.
I can just feel the dishonest reliance on ENCODE's 2012 paper coming.
As we realize that the genome is very, very complex.
Yeah, and
that everything is not based on structural genes. Originally, when you talk about evolution, you talk about a gene, a protein. And a protein can be an enzyme that leads to a certain process. So you have structural genes, and that's what you look like. That's what you transfer. You have a lot of this irrelevant DNA that's mixed in there. But most of the genome actually consists of controlling genes.
I don't know what a controlling gene is. Searching for it doesn't turn up any sources, scholarly or not, that use controlling as an active participle. It's all gerunds. So that's not what he means, because by saying made up of controlling genes, the grammar doesn't admit any other interpretation. So it seems like Walter just made up a new term in genetics. Conveniently, that also makes it impossible to check up on what he could say about so-called controlling genes. If he simply means regulatory sequences, then no, regulation is sequence constrained, and so any DNA which is not sequence constrained is not a regulatory reason. Since the majority of the human genome is not sequence constrained, the majority of the genome cannot be regulatory in function. Maybe he means Hox genes? Those are developmental genes that do a lot of work controlling the development of an organism in embryo. But also, the vast majority of your DNA is not made up of Hox genes.
So they don't actually have an expression in the phenotype in what you look like.
Regulatory sequences and Hox genes are like the majority of what you look like. You don't have a single protein that determines your arm length or something. You have various hormones that turn on or off based on regulatory sequences. The big difference between, say, a human and a dog in terms of anatomy mostly comes down to when regulatory sequences and Hox genes turn various genes on and off. This guy is living in an opposite world.
They only control that which happens at that level, and that brings about a whole new concept.
What level? The phenotype level? If you control what happens at the phenotype level, then you control the phenotype. So he's just contradicting himself here.
How to control genes? How do genes, for example, become so that they can be read more often than previously?
Like in lactase persistence or lactose tolerance. That's caused by one of a few mutations that cause the promoter region for the lactase enzyme to be more active, resulting in lactase production persisting into adulthood, a well-documented series of beneficial mutations in humans. Neat. Also, being able to eat some cheese without a disaster on the toilet is part of your phenotype.
You can go, for example, in one generation from a small rat to a giant rat.
That sounds like a whole heck of a lot of change in phenotype. Let me know in the comments, does Walter even know what a phenotype is? It doesn't seem like it to me.
Just by translocating a gene to a specific locus where it is read more often and produces more growth hormone than it would normally do, and you go in one generation from small to large.
Okay, yeah, that's plausible, but also it's not a change to any regulatory sequence, so I'm not sure what the heck his point is.
Or vice versa. Now, those would be considered evolutionary processes that took a long time, but we know that they can take place instantly, but they're not evolution.
Wrong on both counts. We know that relatively minor mutations can cause significant morphological change in a single generation. In fact, we know evolutionary sequences often bounce around in terms of total body size, exactly because that's the kind of thing that it's fairly easy to change with a simple mutation. But it absolutely is evolution. Evolution can be defined in a few different ways that all amount to the same thing. Evolution is a change in the heritable characteristics of a population over time. Since this is obviously that, this is evolution. Walter really isn't making it seem plausible that he's telling the truth, is he? If this is the kind of thing he was teaching his students, then no wonder he was removed from teaching. He was just lying to them.
They are built into the genetic system to enable the genetic system to actually bring about rapid change within the parameters of the species.
Right.
There is no such thing as the parameters of the species. This goes back to the barrier problem. Once we acknowledge that natural selection works and that mutations can change an organism in a way that increases fitness, you've basically admitted to the basics of evolution, and it's hard to see why you would balk at the rest of it. But creationists obviously do balk at it. Walter is okay with acknowledging change via mutation, and I assume he's also okay with selection, since basically all creationists are. So this presents the problem of how can they accept the main mechanisms of evolution, but not the whole science that goes with it. The answer tends to be to claim that there are barriers to evolution. God supposedly created kinds, he knows the barriers around them, and somehow, genetics is prevented from escaping these bounds, or as Walt has put it, parameters. The problem is that there is no evidence of any such barrier, nor is it possible to identify kinds, so this is all just nonsense.
How come they cannot just make the missing link?
For the same reason that historians can't just make Hannibal crossing the Alps. Past organisms are in the past, and even if they were recreated, it wouldn't actually be the original organisms that were ancestral to some extant organisms, and had an intermediate and mosaic anatomy, linking even more basal ancestors with later, more derived descendants. I'm sorry, but unlike the Jesuits, scientists don't have access to time travel.
If you can edit these genes and you could do that, why wouldn't evolutionists say, let's create something that would forever seal this deal that there's some, ape man walking around?
Because of the ethical concerns that Keith was talking about, and the fact that it wouldn't actually be providing evidence of anything, and that there's no need to provide more evidence to show that humans share common ancestry with other apes. This is exactly like when a flat earther demands that some experiment that wouldn't work be done by NASA, as if NASA cared to relitigate the shape of the Earth, and would do so in a way that wouldn't actually do that. Scotty needs to learn a whole lot more about biology before he's ready to ask questions about what experiments would make sense to conduct.
That missing link never existed.
Let's go again.
But I mean, do they have the technology to kind of create that?
Create what? A human with long arms and a small brain case? I don't know. Who cares? Why would anyone want to do that? Why would anyone allow that to be done?
And they would have to amalgamate.
And you can tell that.
You can do that. There's a category of animals that doesn't exist today in the world. It's called the mammal-like reptiles.
That's a word that hasn't been current in literature in decades. I guess Walt here stopped reading paleontology literature in about the 90s. The word that Walter is looking for here is synapsids. And synapsids are so much around that Walt is one of them.
In the fossil record, you have mammals and you have reptiles.
And a lot of other things, but okay.
And then you have another category, a huge category of animals called mammal-like reptiles. They don't exist today, not one of them.
Unless you count the more than 5,000 species of mammals, including Homo sapiens, then there are lots of them. In fact, one might say that they're the dominant land animals.
They're gone.
Dinosaurs in that category?
No, dinosaurs are not in that category. Dinosaurs are reptiles.
Unlike synapsids, by the way, which are not reptiles at all, despite the fact that Walter anachronistically keeps calling them that.
But you have mammal-like reptiles which have features of both mammals and reptiles.
No, they don't. They have some features of derived mammals, and some features which are basal to amniotes or even tetrapods that mammals have altered or changed. This is exactly what's expected in evolution. Similarly, early reptiles lacked some of the features of later reptiles, while also retaining in common with early synapsids fairly basal amniote traits.
They don't exist.
He said, despite being one.
Do you think that was man messing with amalgamations?
Yeah, humans were going around in the Permian mixing together reptile DNA with their own mammal DNA and creating the horrors of the Gorgonopsids and Dinocephalians. That makes all sorts of sense. Never mind that DNA wasn't even discovered as the molecule of inheritance until the 20th century. The stupidity is getting out of control.
Today I would speculate that direction, but, you know... As
only the animals that God created got on that ark, you know?
As an evolution, I would not, but I find it interesting.
I find it interesting that Walt is just going to go along with lunacy, when he obviously has to know better.
That those creatures do not exist today. There's no reason why they shouldn't be viable, because they were a huge category of animals.
Yeah.
Well, I have great news for Walt. They do exist. We just tend to call them mammals, not synapsids. And no one who's up to date on taxonomy calls anything mammal-like reptiles anymore. Scotty then describes his death wish. I'm going to skip that.
But there are fossils to prove that category existed?
Oh,
Is that what you're saying?
there are thousands and thousands of fossils of mammal-like reptiles, yes.
Let's see some. And keep in mind that none of these animals are actually true mammals. They're all non-mammal synapsids.
Wow.
Interesting. Actually, to that point, I have a question. You were part of a project called The Days of Noah, or is it?
Yeah,
The Days of
the
Noah?
videos.
It's a 4-part series. I got through the first 2. Fascinating, chock full of information.
Oh no, my X key broke because of how hard I was pressing it to doubt.
But I noticed they were explaining all the proofs that are out there towards the flood.
All 0, huh? Impressive.
Even here in North America, we have the Grand Canyon and all that, the information that's there.
Yeah, we do, and just the time it would take to lithify all that rock, such that the canyon could be carved in it, is enough to preclude a flood being the cause of the rocks. And further, the canyon itself is not in a shape that could be explained by rapid water runoff, so that too precludes it from being caused by Noah's flood. And that's before we get to any radiometric dating, which we don't even need to use on the Grand Canyon to demonstrate quite conclusively that there never was a worldwide flood.
But it was kept in the realm of animals. Where are the antediluvians? Where are the people who died during the flood? Do we have any proof of them?
Now that is an excellent question. Kendi might be the only person with a brain in that whole room. The thing is, there is no answer to that question that isn't special pleading, so let's see how specially Walter pleads.
We have fossils that don't really fit into the paradigm as they should.
Well, first, no, we don't. And he won't name any such, because, second, that's not what Kendi asked. She didn't ask if there were fossils that ran counter to the evolution narrative. She asked specifically where are the antediluvian human fossils.
There are fossils of very large human beings.
Like what size?
Humans of the past were generally significantly smaller than today. I would love a citation for this, because the only evidence I've seen of this is people not knowing how perspective and geometry works, combined with frauds. In fact, I have a whole video series I did with Vishanti talking about alleged giants in North America. Guess what? There never were any such things.
Let's say up to 3 meters.
In feet.
Americans will do anything to avoid this metric system. 3 meters is about 3/5 of a giraffe. Does that help?
And you have artifacts.
Let's start with the citations for the giant humans. Except, of course, we can't because there are no such things. Walter is just lying once again.
And in the past of civilizations that just don't fit the paradigm, you've...
Can this man give me one concrete example of any of this bullshit? Guess what? I can just say that I found Walter's brain and it's actually calcified at the bottom of a pool in Phoenix. And in doing so, I've given more specificity than he has in this whole topic. Where is there a single verified giant bone? Where is there a single verified out-of-place artifact? Who has them? How can I see them? What tests have been done? Walter must love having such a friendly interview. I wonder how he'd feel if I were to have him on.
Find hammers and kinds of steel which we are not even able to reproduce today.
Oh, this is a reference to the London hammer, which is named for London, Texas, not the London that's the capital of England. It's one of Karl Baugh's alleged artifacts. It's nothing more than a 19th century miner's hammer with a calcium concretion around it. It has no provenance, and the claims about it being made of some mysterious alloy are completely unsubstantiated. One thing this does help make sense of, though, is Walt's level of buffoonery. If he buys into Baugh's bullshit, then it's no wonder he's been saying so many stupid things in this whole interview.
But you are right. The vast amounts of, or numbers of fossils that you would expect are not there.
Almost like there never was a Noah's flood.
Now, why are they not there?
I know why, but Walt isn't going to like it.
Well, that's an interesting mute point. We can get into the metaphysics there.
I feel like we can just stick to the physics, since, human remains and floods are both physical objects. I think we can probably explain what should happen in such a circumstance without reference to uncaused causes, ontological necessity, or the foundations of reality.
But the Bible says that this world was destroyed because of sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, but since other animals from that world were destroyed, it clearly can't be that the world was destroyed without a trace. Or it could mean that, and now Walt can't actually pretend that the fossils were formed by the flood. That might actually be a tactically better option for him, but it might require him to abandon a young Earth, so he probably won't go for it.
And where would you find sin most prevalent? There where
valleys.
Humanity lived in congregations.
Mm-hmm.
So like along rivers and coasts, since that's where most cities are.
Like Sodom and Gomorrah, for example.
In the valley.
Yes. So where would you find probably the fossils that are associated with it? There where the destruction is the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but we also find shallow marine and fluvial deposits that are full of animals that lived in and around those areas. So why not the humans? Are human bones significantly more brittle than the rays of fish swimming in a river? I would suggest that it's the opposite, actually.
Now, where is the destruction the greatest? Where's the greatest evidence of destruction? You mentioned the Grand Canyon.
It's nowhere, because nothing in the world is evidence for a worldwide flood. So the evidence is entirely in the heads of anti-science types, like Walt and Kent.
It's one of those beautiful features that shows a very rapid, catastrophic formation of the canyon.
This is Horseshoe Bend. It's a famous part of the Eastern Grand Canyon. As you can see, it preserves a meander. Only slow-flowing rivers meander, meaning that the Grand Canyon cannot have been formed rapidly, or there would be no meanders. And this is far from the only meander in the main canyon. It's just the most dramatic one.
The theories of slow formation just don't fit in the Grand Canyon area.
Once again, do we get a citation for this? No, of course not. Just trust me, bro. You see, Walt is a guy who got fired from teaching students lies about anatomy and physiology, so he must know a lot about geology, and you should totally just take his word, even though he's a demonstrable liar. Don't worry about it. You don't want to die, do you? Well, according to Walt the Lying Liar, you won't have to worry about it if you just listen to him, and for some reason that involves lying about the Grand Canyon.
Because you don't have rivers cutting through hills, they go around hills.
I assume he means the Kaibab uplift, but the fun thing about that is in its name. It's an uplift. It didn't exist when the initial incision into the rocks were being made, and since then its uplift is slower than the rate of erosion. But also, flood runoff doesn't cut through hills either erodes them down or goes around them. So Walt's flood version still doesn't work, and for the same reason he pretends that the scientific explanation doesn't work. That really is a special kind of stupid.
But in that case, it was the case.
What does that mean? Whatever, it doesn't matter.
But the greatest canyons in the world are not on land. They're under the ocean.
That's right.
Trenches and canyons aren't the same thing.
Canyons that are
Unexplored.
vastly superior to what you find.
Since superior literally means higher, I'd say that they are inferior because of how low they are. But that's just a silly etymology joke.
So, you have the theory of Atlantis.
The theory of Atlantis, huh? I'm sure Disney will be happy to know that one of their worst performing animated movies is now a theory. Atlantis comes from exactly one place, the writings of Plato, where he puts the story into the mouth of Socrates as a parable about hubris. All other takes on Atlantis are derivative of that one piece of fiction by Plato. There is no evidence for Atlantis. It suggests no new areas of research that have ever turned up anything. It does not successfully explain any data. Calling Atlantis a theory is an insult to both Plato and to science, and further, virtually all modern ideas about the actual existence of Atlantis trace back to, the Nazis. So let's not spread Nazi fantasies.
Mm-hmm. And the lost civilizations. What if humanity largely congregated and were destroyed, and most of those fossils are under the ocean?
Then we'd still find them, because fossils are pulled out of the ocean. And also, we have oceanic fossils on land today, so there are two methods for us to find fossils of antediluvian man. Yet still, we don't.
Yeah, deep below where you could probably easily get to them.
Weird how that seems not to apply to other marine fossils. Remember last time I said that his answer to Kendi's question about the missing human fossils would involve special pleading? I guess that was a successful prediction. I've now done more science in this video series than Walter has in becoming a Seventh-day Adventist.
Correct. And then there would be a lot of trapped organic material down there. Mm-hmm. You know what? Yeah. Maybe we're driving with them today.
Yeah, except that we know how oil forms and is primarily from plant matter, and not from ocean plants either. So that doesn't solve the problem in the least.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the oil fields, of course, the great ones are under the ocean. Now, what if vast categories of creatures. Now, there where you had rural areas or where populations were not largely distributed.
Or they were just along upland rivers. A place humans also like to settle, and that can't be accounted for with this oil is people idea?
You would find the other animals like you would today. So those fossils we can find on land.
So more special pleading. Got it. Hey, here's an idea for why we can't find antediluvian humans. There never was a deluge, so nothing came before it.
But when we find them, they are also all in watery graves.
Hey look, a bunch of American rhinos in subaerial ash in Ashfall Beds, Nebraska. Oh, and what's this? The fighting dinosaurs from the Jadochta Formation in Mongolia? Sorry, Mongolians, if I murder that. Why, that's Aeolian sandstone. Neither of these are things formed by water. How odd that Walter would simply lie about these. And of course he's ignoring that water isn't synonymous with flood water, and that many of the water-deposited fossiliferous layers of rock on Earth physically cannot be deposited by a flood, including all the organic limestone.
Now, we always say in the evolution theory that they were in riverbeds.
First, that's going to be geology and taphonomy that will tell you that. And second, that's because geologists know how rivers deposit rock and recognize it when they see it. I'm sure Walt is just waiting to publish his paper about how all geologists are wrong about rivers, and he's actually the real genius. I won't hold my breath for the publication, though.
And that flash floods sort of buried these creatures, or they were ponds and the creatures came to drink, got stuck in the mud, etc.
Those are very different and distinguishable scenarios. When scientists say things like this, they're not just guessing. They can look and see that the sediment is consistent with soft, fine-grained mud that could trap an animal. Or if there are things like graded conglomerate that might indicate a flash flood. They're not just tossing darts at a dartboard labeled with things that can move sediment and just going with whatever they hit first.
That doesn't happen today. You don't get fossilization because scavengers eat them up, bacterial rotting takes place. There's no fossilization of that nature.
That's actually a really good point.
That would be a good point, if it were true, but it's not. Look up something called subfossils, and you will find that they are the remains of organisms that are undergoing a fossilization process. And to be doing that today means that there are fossils forming today. If fossils weren't forming, we wouldn't have things that are in the process of becoming fossils. We do, therefore fossils are forming today.
Yeah, the only thing
That's
really
a good
makes...
point that I've never really even kind of considered that before.
That's because it's not true, but once again, Scotty is willing to swallow anything Veith tosses at him because Scotty has no critical thinking and seems to be entirely governed by confirmation bias.
Wait, we don't see that happening right now.
No, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it does. In bogs, on beaches, in sedimentary basins. It's happening all the time. It's famously happening all the time at Lake Natron, so named for the salt that it's full of that both kills and preserves animals.
But you find rapid burial of anything from a dinosaur to whales.
Actually, the best fossils tend to result from relatively slow burial.
And the interesting thing is they're often stream orientated. So you find these creatures lying in a particular direction. Now that is only possible if it's catastrophic.
I've heard this claim before, but only from creationists, and I've never seen a source for it. If any of you watching know where creationists get this talking point from, please let me know. Really, most fossils are a jumbled mess with no clear facing.
Now 99% of all fossils are in mud beds.
I guess if you have a wide enough definition for mud, that's probably true.
So in other words, they are water depositions. And if you still have orientation, then that is catastrophism.
But near as I can tell, we don't, and Walter hasn't offered anything to make anyone believe him. In fact, given how much he's lied, we all have very good reason to suspect anything he says may be untrue.
But it wasn't universal, they will say. Because as soon as you have a universal destruction, evolution ends.
That's right.
I mean, only if everything goes extinct, which I don't think is a likely outcome of a global flood. Any survivors will continue to evolve.
Because you have to develop to the point of humanity.
Humanity isn't the goal of evolution.
If you wipe everything out, then you would have to start the evolution process all over again, right?
No. If literally everything is gone, then sure, evolution probably ends. As extinction is the end of evolution for a lineage. But if that's not the case, then those organisms that survive don't undo the evolution they've gone through up to that point. Further, he's talking like evolution is complete now with the arrival of humans. But that's not at all true. Humans are not the end goal of evolution, nor are they immune to evolution, nor does their existence stop evolution except in those lineages that they drive to extinction. None of this makes a bit of sense, so of course our hosts are just nodding along and making agreeable lowing noises.
Right, and you got humans quickly.
Science cannot allow a universal flood.
Sure it can, if there's evidence for it. The first geologists were going out to look for the signs of the Great Noachian Deluge. They wanted to find it. They failed, and they kept failing, and eventually they stopped trying. Nothing about a global flood is in principle unscientific. It's a hypothesis like any other. It's just that every time we test it, it gets falsified.
Listen to that breakdown in almost every level, which ties back to evolution.
Yeah, so you only had local floods.
Local floods are the floods for which compelling evidence has been provided. If Walt wants to publish his compelling evidence for a global flood, he's welcome to. In fact, anyone is. The reason they don't is because they have no compelling evidence. Instead, they have lies that would be recognized by the average college sophomore in geology, and that's me being generous to the flood geologists. Most of their points wouldn't make it past a group of high schoolers in earth science class.
Now, most of the fossils, as I say, are of that nature, are watery demises.
Well, most of them are found in waterborne sediment, but that doesn't actually mean they died in the water. Things can fall into the water and be buried post-mortem.
You get a couple that are, let's say, buried in volcanic ash.
By a couple, he means hundreds. And when that ash is subaerial, it precludes a flood as the cause for the fossils, or it having happened during the same time when the volcano was erupting.
But then you have mainly molds of whatever there was before.
It's fun how, once again, I get to show ashfall beds in Nebraska, because that totally annihilates that idea. We do find some things preserved as voids in ash. That's how the people of Pompeii were preserved. The 3D figures of them you see in museums were actually created by filling in the voids, then clearing the ash.
You will find that at Vesuvius, for example. You'll find even humans burnt away, so only the casing remains of whatever there was.
Yes, but that's because those people died in pyroclastic flows, not subaerial ash. Those aren't the same thing, and actual fossils in pyroclastic flows are basically unheard of, because over geological time it's very unlikely that a void in a rock will last long as the rock comes under increasing pressure. Bones, on the other hand, are largely incompressible, and so they can survive much higher pressures, the kind of pressure that exists under the ground.
Or you'd have them in peat or in oil or in something like that where they are buried. You'll find those in peat bogs, for example.
That is formed by water. That is not a contrast to water burial.
Those are probably post-flood fossilizations.
But happened quickly.
Right, because earlier he said we don't have fossils forming today. Except that now he says we do. Fun times. The guy can't even keep his own lies straight.
So that's the kind of humanity that you would find. You would find something here, you'd find something there, but you wouldn't find the masses that you would expect.
Yeah, fossilization has never been very prevalent. It's a rare phenomenon that doesn't happen to most organisms.
But they're probably under the ocean.
I'm willing to grant that, but we don't find anything. And all Walter has pointed to are hoaxes and misinterpretations.
And that's why you have mythologies like Atlantis.
How in the ever-loving does that follow? Remember, Atlantis goes back literally to just one parable in Plato. It's not a widespread motif or ancient mythology, and there is literally no evidence that people took it seriously as a real event in the times of Plato. Also, weird how we don't see any creationists pulling up human fossils in the Mesozoic offshore deposits, even though we can and do pull up dinosaurs from such depths. Famously, Plateosaurus bones were pulled up by oil rig workers doing an exploratory drill in the North Sea.
Wow.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And the demonic world, they understand and know what happened.
Oh, they sure do.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood, burned by the embers of Armageddon, his soul blistered by the fires of hell, and tainted beyond ascension. He chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred, he found no peace, and with boiling blood, he scoured the umbral plains, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him.
And they're taking those stories of like, there's something under there. And if we tell enough stories, like they're probably paying attention to prophecy going, hey, this is a really great way to make people believe some truth over here.
How the f*** did we go from the already level 10 absurd idea that the flood is the real source for Atlantis to also now there's a demonic conspiracy? To do what? Misdirect ocean exploration? Trick people into thinking Atlantis is real? I don't even know. This is right up there with the satanic conspiracy to hide giraffes proposed by Job Martin.
And so if we start talking about it over here, then somebody finds something over here, it's going to believe it.
What the hell is Scotty even talking about? Is he okay? Can someone please call in a wellness check for this guy? I'm not sure he should be allowed to govern his own affairs.
And the idea is always, it was primitive then and it has to be advanced now. And these people were stupid and we're brilliant.
Yeah.
No, technological advancement has gone back and forth, although the overall trend has been towards more technological advancement through the history of humanity. But two things are also true. That humans in the developed world are objectively and unarguably the most technologically advanced humans that have ever been, and that in no way makes modern humans more intelligent than humans 10,000 years ago. Imagine if you had all your memories wiped and replaced with some very basic survival skills. Basically, you're amnesiac Bear Grylls. But you're also someplace where drinking your own urine is only an option, rather than a necessity. And we'll say that you have a collection of some 50 or so other humans, some male, some female, all with the same amnesia. How far do you think you could advance science and technology on your own with those people in the wilderness during your lifetime? Remember, you don't know what the scientific method is. You don't know any of the stuff you learned in school. You can't write. And on top of that, you need to survive. Chances are you probably wouldn't make too many innovations. But that doesn't mean you're stupid. Similarly, we look at famous geniuses like Einstein or Leonardo or Avicenna as amazing minds. But how many similar geniuses toiled away in mines or on farms, or died in a trench during a war, simply never having had the opportunity to leave a mark on the world commensurate with their intellectual ability. The modern heights of technology are there because people have the opportunity to innovate and the ability to pass down knowledge so that we don't have to start anew every generation. It is not an indication of higher intelligence now than in the past.
Yeah, but that's not it. Yeah.
If you go into the archaeological world, how did they transport or even cut those huge pillars out of the ground?
That were as hard as stone.
First, I love that Scotty has to remind us that stone pillars are as hard as stone. Thanks, buddy. Anyway, how were pillars cut out of stone? Well, we have archaeological evidence of how people in ancient times worked stone. The stone for the pillars was quarried as large box shapes, and the process was fairly straightforward. First, a part of a quarry was identified as likely not to have cracks that would ruin the size of the block needed. Then the block was likely outlined with charcoal or chalk or something. Then quarrymen started roughly cutting the block out of the quarry. What tools they used for this varied, but included things like pounding stones and chisels made of copper, bronze, and iron. Eventually, all that would be left connecting the stone block to the quarry would be a thin bit of rock, which would be generally snapped with a lever or levers of some kind, whether wood or metal later. That's how big stones were extracted from quarries. The finishing wasn't done in situ at the quarry, but on site under the supervision of experts who had access to tools like compasses, plumb bobs, straight edges, saws, smaller chisels, and polishing stones. Pillars do not now and never have emerged perfectly formed from a quarry.
We can't do that today. You'd need specialized laser technology in order to do that.
Yes, we can. The fact that today we use fancier technology doesn't mean we couldn't do it the old-fashioned way. What is this argument? I have a coffee machine and a coffee grinder. To make coffee, I filled a reservoir with water, grab pre-roasted beans from a bag, grind them, put those in a filter, then flip a switch. I could grab some green coffee beans, roast them on a wood fire I built myself, then draw water from a well, crush my roasted beans in a mortar, then put them in my well water and boil that over my wood fire, then pour it into a mug using gravity filtration to minimize coffee grounds in my coffee. But I don't. Because why the hell would I? Similarly, the fact that modern rock quarries are quarried with fancy modern technology doesn't mean that we couldn't use ancient technology, but what would be the point?
We find artifacts that are hard to explain. We find hieroglyphics that are hard to explain.
Once again, I'm going to need to see a citation. I'm not even sure what it means for a hieroglyphic to be hard to explain. We know what basically every hieroglyph is, and while a few are abstract, none of them are like computers or spaceships or something. At least no compelling case for any such glyphs has been put forth to my knowledge.
And the technology might even have been far advanced to what we have today.
Like a printer?
I love that Scotty's idea of high tech that surpasses our own is a printer. What an absolute pea-brain.
Yes, all kinds of objects. They find cathode rays, they find all kinds of materials in the fossil record.
First, cathode rays can't be found in the fossil record because they're beams of electrons. They don't preserve. But if we give Walter a very undeserved benefit of the doubt and say he meant cathode ray tubes, well, we don't have any of those in the fossil record either. But also, that's not technology that surpasses our own. Cathode ray tubes were cutting edge more than a century ago. We've moved on a bit. Also, there are no printers in the fossil record, and if anyone wants to contest that, they're welcome to cite the fossil of a cathode ray tube or printer.
And also technologies that we have lost, that we are not capable of, that we are still wondering about.
Like Roman concrete? That's the only one that comes to mind, and Walter seems hesitant to give any concrete examples. This sounds like the ramblings of some guy who got high for the first time and started watching Graham Hancock.
And that's sort of hidden archaeology.
Yeah, I got a friend of mine that I love to talk about, random things in the world, and he's always talking to me about the even in the world wars, they were looking for Noah's tools.
Yes,
I always thought that was interesting.
So we get drunk, so we smoke weed.
You mentioned the Tower of Babel.
He sure did. I wonder if this will be any smarter than the nonsense coming from Bodie Hodge, formerly of Answers in Genesis.
And the Bible says God there confused the languages, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you just take language, for example, if language were evolutionary, then you would have a progression from simple sounds to complex language.
I mean, yeah, at some point, but Homo sapiens evolved like 300,000 years ago. And we don't even know that that was when language started. It could have started 1 million years ago with an even earlier species. And just like cathode rays, sound waves are really bad at preserving in rock.
But if you go through the history of languages,
which we really can't do much farther back than about 8,000 years if we're being generous, or less than 3% of the time just Walter's species has existed.
They're always far more structured and complex in the past than what they are today.
No, they're not. Let's look at, say, English. Old English had a more complex system of noun cases, but modern English has a much more complex verbal system with auxiliary verbs appending onto various other verb forms such as participles to form an almost absurdly complex system of tense and aspectual distinctions. African American vernacular English has taken this even farther, with at least one additional verbal mood generally lacking in standard American or British English. Modern Mandarin uses an extremely complex system of compounding lexical elements to overcome a relatively low syllable count, as well as using complex syntactic methods to allow words to perform different grammatical roles across multiple clauses. Finnish has so many noun cases that it's not even agreed how many there are. Swahili uses a large number of genders combined with gendered marking for verbal arguments to allow for free word order within a clause without needing noun cases. What about Latin, Babylonian, Ancient Chinese, or Sanskrit is measurably more complex than modern English, Swahili, or Mandarin? This is something people who know nothing about linguistics say. As a language evolves through time, parts of the language will indeed simplify, but other parts will complexify, and there is no clear way to measure either of these so that we can say how complex any language is compared to any other language, or whether a single language is becoming more or less complex diachronically.
Interesting.
We've actually had to simplify them because we've become dumbed down.
Who is this we? I certainly haven't simplified the language I speak. Notice also that so far, he hasn't actually told us how languages are simpler now than in the past. I mean, I could give examples of things about past forms of a language that are more complex in the past than now. For example, modern extemporaneous Arabic almost never uses case markers, whereas classical Arabic does use 3 case markers on nouns. English used to have a robust gender system for nouns much like other Germanic languages, and even most other Indo-European and even Afro-Asiatic languages. It no longer does. But as I already showed, I can also give instances in which modern languages are complex, often in ways their ancestral languages were not.
We're like goldfish.
Yeah. if you take Shakespeare, he had a vocabulary of 28,000 words.
A bunch of which he made up himself. But also, some guy having a big vocabulary within a language isn't a measurement of the language's complexity. It's a measure of that guy's knowledge of that language. So this is a category error.
Yeah.
And the average person today has about 5,000 words.
I'll just accept that. Shakespeare was a professional writer, so comparing his vocabulary to that of the average person today is not a fair comparison. We need to compare his vocabulary to a modern professional writer. But further, he's also just wrong. The sources I can find say that the average adult English speaker has a vocabulary of about 10,000 to 35,000, while the Oxford Dictionary has about 300,000 entries. In daily life, however, most speakers will only use a fraction of their total vocabulary. For example, I happen to know what the word fortuitous means, but it's not an everyday word for me. Similarly, I know what anti-disestablishmentarianism means, but it's not like I have a lot of conversations about the political position that the Church of England should stay the State Church of England. And of course, this is still a category error. The vocabulary of a single speaker is completely irrelevant to the complexity of a language, or even the total number of lexical items in that language.
Which we're probably exposed to more words just from your phone and
Correct.
all this.
And the cases that you used, the nominative, accusative, dative, and all of those, they were all incorporated in a very complex structure so that you could very precisely describe things.
Many languages still use those cases and more, so this is a bit Anglo-centric, but the cases that English used to have simply been replaced by other syntactic strategies. And English now is no less precise than English in the 9th century. For example, the sentence, Bita thon man se hund is Old English for the dog bit the person. So is the sentence, thon man bita se hund, and also the sentence, se hund bita thon man. In Old English, who did what to whom was determined by case, which was most easily determined by the definite article. In this case, the word se means the, but also it indicates that the word that follows it is the subject of the clause. The word thona also means the, but tells us that the noun it is attached to is the direct object of the clause. In modern English, we don't mark general nouns for case, and instead, we use word order. the dog bit the man does not mean the same thing as the man bit the dog. Neither of these is more precise. It's simply two different strategies to mark who does what to whom. Further, English retains a genitive case. Anytime you put apostrophe S at the end of a noun in English, you're putting it in the genitive case, even if you're used to hearing it called the possessive or the possessive case.
Also in the different cases. Now, the King James Version still uses thee, thine.
Yeah, even English in 2024 still has cases for personal pronouns. That's why we have pronouns like she, her, hers, he, him, his. Those are nominative, accusative, and genitive respectively, although the accusative is also used for when Old English might use the separate dative case. Thee, thine, thy is just an explicitly singular second person, which contrasts with the plural ye, you, your, which is polite or plural. Also, modern English is in numerous dialects regaining an explicit number distinction in the second person, with words like y'all and yous.
Ye, your, you, for a very specific reason.
That specific reasoning being that that's how pronouns worked at an earlier stage in English.
Because without it, you would not be able to determine exactly who you are speaking to. Take, for example, Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, and he says, verily, verily, I say unto thee. That's singular. He's addressing Nicodemus. Ye, that's plural, must be born again.
So, the relevant passage here is John 3, 5 through 7, which I will read from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Quote, Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. What is born of flesh is flesh. What is born of the spirit is spirit. Do not be astonished that I say to you, you must be born from above. End quote. In the King James, it reads, quote, Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born again. End quote. The underlying Greek does indeed switch to plural in verse 7. But also, let's think about this. Has anyone ever actually interpreted John 3:7 as Jesus telling just Nicodemus that he needs to be born again, but that it does not mean anyone else does? I very much doubt it. And if the translators of more recent versions had wanted to, they could have made the switch to plural explicit by just saying all of you instead of you. Because even though Standard English does not make a number distinction in second person personal pronouns, the language can still make the distinction when it is necessary. Similarly, if English needs to be explicit about a singular second person, you can use phrases like just you, only you, or you alone. See what I mean? You can't just simply look at something like how many distinct personal pronouns a language has, then declare that the smaller the number, the simpler the language. Nor does doing that mean that a language is more or less precise overall.
Wow.
If you take that out, you lose those connotations.
Only if you want them to be lost. English has strategies to disambiguate such things when necessary. It's just that it's not normally necessary. Really, think about it. How often in your life does the fact that you might refer to one person or more than one person actually cause confusion for you when you are reading, writing, speaking, or listening to English? For me, it's almost never, which is why English has been doing just fine without a number distinction in personal pronouns.
That just opens up your mind to go like, I appreciate the King James Version tons more just from that sentence.
The King James is based partially on out-of-date grammars of Greek and manuscripts that we know are late and full of various late additions. Modern translations of the Bible, using editions of the text that are based on a fuller knowledge of the manuscripts, are better. Further, much of the language of the King James was out of date even when it was published and is downright confusing to modern readers. Here's an example. In Genesis 1:28, God tells the humans he has created to replenish the earth. Similarly, in Genesis 9:1, God says that Noah and his sons should replenish the earth. So were the humans in Genesis 1 to go repopulate an earth that used to have humans but no longer did, like they were in 9:1? No, in the language of the King James, replenish simply means fill, not fill again. There is no bare verb plenish, meaning fill, and the modern use of the word with that meaning is by analogy with other words that have the prefix of re, meaning to do again. Indeed, in the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, the word is simply fill in both cases. And indeed, the underlying Hebrew verb is the same in both verses in the Masoretic text. So in addition to the King James including verses that were not originally part of the text, it also includes language that will give modern readers the wrong impression. The King James is an important part of the English literary tradition as well as the history of Christianity in English-speaking countries. But it is in fact a bad Bible for either devotional or scholarly work.
That wasn't in the common language at the time. They had simplified it to the simple you, which by the way is plural.
No, it was plural, But leaving the explicit number distinction was not a deliberate choice by the translation team of the King James Version. The King James is not a new translation starting from scratch. It is a revision of the earlier Bishop's Bible in which one of the mandates was to make as few changes as necessary. The King James uses thee, thou, and thy because the Bishop's Bible did.
Wow.
And is not singular, but is used in a singular fashion today.
If language is used in a particular way today, then that's what it means today. You is singular and plural in standard English now. Walt doesn't have to like it, he doesn't even have to agree. But it simply is. Words mean what people use them to mean. Indeed, even in that sentence, I just use the word people as the plural form of the word person. Originally, people was a word that meant about the same thing as ethnic group or nation. It was a singular word, and the plural form was not unusual, peoples. But in English today, it's the plural form of the word person. That's how English speakers use the word, so that's what the word means.
What I'm saying is language was far more structured and complex in the past than it is now.
Right.
And his sole example was that standard English doesn't have a plurality distinction in second-person personal pronouns, even though many varieties of English spoken today do. Yeah, if you think he's proven his case, let me know in the comments, but I have to say, it's going to take a whole lot more than pointing out one weird thing about English pronouns grammarians don't want you to know.
So is that evolution or is that devolution on the level of language?
Neither. It's just regular old language change, like has been going on for presumably hundreds of thousands of years.
Now we're just like, we take out all the vowels. Seriously.
It's like Scotty is trying to come off as dumb as possible. Typing SRSLY is not an attempt to remove the vowels from the word seriously. It is a written abbreviation. Fundamentally no different than writing Mr. MR period. I very much doubt that Scotty goes through his life alphabetically spelling out every single word. Common words get abbreviated. This has happened throughout history. In Old English, the word that was often written with a single special character. The ampersand symbol, which means and, was originally just a combination of the letters E and T together into a single glyph, because in Latin text the word et, meaning and, came up a lot. In biblical manuscripts and Christian art, words like Jesus, Christ, God, and Mother are often shortened to 2 or 3 letters with a bar over them to indicate it's an abbreviation. Scotty doesn't have to like abbreviating the word seriously by removing all but the last vowel character, but the vowels are still there when people speak. Let me know in the comments if you think Scotty knows that in Hebrew, the language of most of his favorite book is written in, most vowels are not written.
It's like we don't want to type out the thing. We're lazy.
Yeah, welcome to being human, Scotty. Like, is he new to the whole human thing? He looks like he's been doing it a while.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
That really is mind-blowing.
That English personal pronouns have changed? I mean, it's not the first time, and it's still happening. I'm not really sure what's amazing about that. All languages change over time, unless they're dead, and even then they sometimes do. Latin is a dead language that gets new words fairly frequently, because despite not having a community of first language speakers, it is still used in an official capacity at the Vatican City, and so needs ways to refer to modern concepts like motorcycles and the internet.
I was going to sit and chew on that for
right.
right. You know, sit and chew on that for a second. I mean, just so much beautiful things that I think God has preserved in looking at the record of what's happened in the planet. I think that God had that forethought. Things are going to go wrong. People are going to have questions. Let's put them in the earth. You know what I mean? Let the earth cover it in a way that people will dig it up. And
then everyone who doesn't start with the conclusion that the primeval history of Genesis is literally true will come to the conclusion that all the evidence contradicts that possibility. If the geology and fossil record of Earth were created by God to communicate any message at all, it's that Genesis 1 through 11 simply did not happen in any recognizable way.
It should answer what happened back then.
It does, just not in the way that Scotty, Keith, Kendi, or Walter would like.
Otherwise, you just leave it to humans are going to reinterpret everything constantly. It'd be so confusing.
It's kind of like that's why there are so many Protestant denominations.
And so God had to make a way for us to look backwards and see the record and make decisions about what happened.
It must be very frustrating if you're trying to negate something in the Bible and then you dig it up in archaeology.
Yeah.
I guess that would be frustrating, but the history of archaeology is largely the opposite. People trying to confirm biblical stories and then finding out that the evidence is against their historicity. Now, that's not the case for all the stories of the Bible. Some have indeed had confirmation from archaeology, at least in their broad outline. But yeah, it's far more common for someone to go out into the field, Bible in hand, to show how historical the Bible is, and then fail entirely, than it is for someone to go out trying to prove the Bible wrong, but then finding evidence that it's true. Indeed, as far as I can tell, very few, if any, archaeologists are trying to discredit the Bible. They're trying to learn about the past through the material culture that the people of the past left behind. This persecution fetish is not reflected in reality.
Yeah.
Take the year 457 BC, the decree for Artaxerxes.
It's a decree from Artaxerxes, not for him. The decree was for Ezra.
To restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, a very precise prophecy as to when the Messiah would be, inaugurated as the Messiah.
Neither Ezra 7 nor Zechariah 9 contain any dates about the Messiah. Zechariah 9 does have a prophecy about a ruler for God's people coming on a donkey foal, but the timing isn't mentioned. Instead, what's going on is that people in the 19th century were super into prophecy and numerology, and combined various bits of the Bible with references to the restoration of the temple, other random bits, and then massaged the numbers to make prophecies about the coming of Jesus. Of course, the telling thing is that no one before Jesus was able to make these predictions, because they only work if you know the answer in advance. If you have a goal in mind and you're willing to do a lot of work, you can make anything look like it predicts anything, as long as the source text is big enough. And of course, all the predictions about the future that were made using these techniques turned out to be wrong. If you want to know more about how Adventists get this bullshit, you should research the Great Disappointment. Seventh-day Adventists are an outgrowth of the Millerite movement that experienced their then prophets' utter failure at using math and the Bible to predict anything. If you want a more recent example, look at Harold Camping, who predicted that the world would end in 2011, leading many of his followers to quit jobs and sell their homes, leaving them in ruin when it turned out that the world did not end. Using Bible codes and math has never worked because the math used to connect the events in the Bible was never in the Bible in the first place. And so even if the Bible were the infallible word of God, Adventists and their forebears are just making things up on the basis of wishful thinking. But if we don't assume that the Bible is the infallible word of God, then it's even worse. Then it's just people picking some random book and doing math on the basis of nothing to predict events that aren't going to happen anyway. Anytime someone tries to tell you that all this math they did proves that the Bible is true and that the end times are coming, they're wrong. They always have been wrong, they always will be wrong, and you believe them at your own peril. There is a reason most Christian groups don't bother with this nonsense.
And that date as a starting date is cast in stone because it stands on an archaeological find. So it's irrefutable. You cannot move it.
Archaeological dating is rarely precise to the calendar year, so in fact, it can be moved.
Well, that's why I think evolution is an important topic to discuss. I'm glad that you were, able to come on and talk about this topic because I think it's relevant to us today.
Yeah, generally speaking, science is relevant. Perhaps now more than ever. Evolution denial kills people. It causes famine and disease outbreaks that are entirely preventable. Rejecting science has real consequences, and they're not generally good ones either.
I think there's a lot of Christians that just, I don't need to know about that or whatever like that. I have had a very close friend of mine, and he raised his children totally Christian, and his son went to go into college, Christian his whole life, took one class, doesn't believe in God.
Maybe Scotty's friend shouldn't have tied Christianity to obvious lies like evolution being untrue. I know plenty of people who started and ended college Christian. Most of them didn't tie their faith to science denial, though.
And it's like, what you can derail somebody off of, literally a professor.
Or just a book. It turns out that when a key part of your faith is denying demonstrable reality, it's pretty easy to shake that faith.
Well, when I started lecturing on this issue, of course, I come into conflict with all my colleagues.
Translation. When he started lying to students because he thinks his daughter was possessed and then a plumber or something said Ellen G. White was super cool and not cringe. The professors who actually cared about educating rather than miseducating students didn't much care for that.
So the students would ask me in class, because whenever I spoke about these issues, I would say, according to the theory of evolution, this is how it works. And students are very observant, do you know that?
There sure are. Probably why so few of them make it to graduation while still being young Earth creationists.
They would stop me and say, excuse me, you're the only one who ever says that. All the others says this is how it happened. You say, According to the theory of evolution, this is how it happened. Why do you say that? Do you actually not believe it or what?
That's awesome.
Would you give us an answer to that question?
I'm skeptical if this is how it went down. I don't have a way to check, and I also don't super care. I'm going to skip his autobiographical stuff. I don't care how he interacted with his students or colleagues. Basically, Walter says that he had after-hour discussions, and then for some reason, Scotty ties that into thinking that the margarine ad campaign, I can't believe it's not butter, was actually people lying to consumers about something. It's not clear. He's a moron who's only barely more coherent than Ramat. But now, Walt's going to tell us what his students did after he spent some time lying to them at school.
And then they would come into the other people's classes and the guy would say, or whoever it was, the lecturer, this and this and this, what happened? They say, excuse me, that's wrong.
Well, I guess I can see why his colleagues didn't like him. He was getting their students to regurgitate his lies in other classes, thereby disrupting those classes. He definitely should have been fired.
And that created major conflict.
Fireworks.
Wow! Telling students lies and then going on to disrupt numerous other classes wasn't a big hit? How shocking.
Fireworks.
You know, that could have been the coolest YouTube channel back then.
There are plenty of YouTube channels about young Earth creationism. I'm not sure what that would have added. Indeed, Walt is still welcome to start a YouTube channel. I certainly can't stop him.
If you just had a
Those
camera in that
discussions,
room.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Somebody needs to do that.
So he means someone needs to film themselves disrupting a class? Yeah, that's probably a really good way to get disciplined, and it might even be illegal. You can't just film anywhere, and a number of classes I took explicitly forbade video recording. If you're out there and you want to film what amounts to a higher education classroom prank video, you better do your homework on what the code of conduct says in your class, that professor's policies, and the laws in your jurisdiction. Of course, I'm not a lawyer or a representative of your school, so I'm not giving advice except, check.
That's so wise. That's how my pastor taught us students to take tests as we were preparing for college.
Yeah.
Because really, you got to get through it. There's certain classes you just have to take depending on your major. So when it comes to, you have this test, you know the information, you may not agree with the information. Use language. According to so-and-so, this is the answer. And just keep it pushing. Get your grade and, keep your stance firm in the Lord.
Once again, Kendi is the only one with more than one brain cell in the room. Yes, if you think the information you're getting in class and are expected to know is incorrect, feel free to answer test questions with according to or something like that. But don't disrupt class time. Most courses are fairly packed in terms of how much time there is versus how much material there is. Discussions about nonsense like flat Earth or young Earth or anti-evolution should be for after hours. Don't disrupt class like Scotty wants you to, and like Veith's students apparently did.
But Scotty, to your point about the student who just one class and it flipped them, there's 2 points I'd like to make. One, the reverse is also true.
Cool.
The reverse
Good
back
point.
to the Lord, instantaneous, or just finding truth and making the decision to stand for the right.
That sounds a whole lot like finding the belief that makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside and going with it. That's clearly what happened with Walter, and none of our hosts have shown enough understanding of, anything, to make me feel like they have based their beliefs on things like evidence. After this, Kendi says that it's part of the beauty of Christianity. Whatever, I don't care. Keith then jumps in to talk about a guy who he went to college with and who left Christianity.
Yeah, and his knowing who that is, his decision, my personal opinion is it's not based on the science.
To some degree, I agree with this. I don't think science and Christianity are in a strict dichotomy, even if some versions of Christianity are. But when you do what these guys are doing, equating Christianity with science denial, is it any wonder that people would abandon Christianity after learning science?
He based his decision on a relationship.
Well, now Scotty is just describing Walter, because remember, he abandoned his Christianity because of his relationship with his mother, rejoined the Catholic Church because of his relationship with his daughter, and then joined Seventh-day Adventism because of his relationship with, a contractor or something. It's not creationism without a healthy dose of projection.
And he's upset and he's angry, and so it's his way to get back at God and to get back at, his parent.
I think that's a lot of people's experience.
And say, I'm rejecting this because I'm rejecting you.
Well, a lot of people have faced abuse at the hands of a religious parent, and not too infrequently the religion is used to excuse the abuse. Proverbs 13:24 just explicitly endorses child abuse. If you want your kids to stay a part of your religion when you can't actually force them to, maybe don't abuse them and then blame your religion for the abuse.
It's not it's not about the information from Christianity. It's about rejecting the individual like was in your case.
Look, maybe it was. Maybe that guy had no intellectual problems with the propositions of Seventh-day Adventism. But that doesn't actually change that such problems exist. And some people are going to leave because of them. Fundamentally, the Earth isn't flat, young, or surrounded by water. Evolution is real. These are things that are at odds with a literal reading of Genesis. So if you insist on a literal reading of Genesis 1 through 11, people have good reason to reject your ideas. Then it's Kendi saying that God will make things right in the end? Okay.
For every argument out there on the evolutionary level, there is a counter-argument which is equally as plausible.
Weird then how none are ever presented. What is he, keeping them a secret? Is this like what really goes on in those Christian meetings after all the catechumens are dismissed? They go over the real reasons young Earth creationism is implausible that us plebs don't get to know about?
So if you actually put them on the table, and that's why you have so many creationists today, and
I mean, they're a declining portion of the population even in the former US, so I'm not sure what he's talking about.
there was an argument once about, who would become a creationist in this modern world. He would have to be insane.
No, just very misled, or someone who prioritizes emotion over evidence, like Walter. I don't think that's necessarily insane, but then again, it's not like I'm a psychologist, so what do I know? But okay, I'm done with this whole cope session about people not buying their bullshit. Let's cut back in after we get some more actual science-type claims.
God would never expect you to go against facts and knowledge.
Walter might, though. In fact, he manifestly does. And if God is such a fan of facts and knowledge, then why are so many of his fans so dishonest?
That is called irreducible complexity.
Ah, irreducible complexity. One of the most strongly falsified ideas in young Earth creationism. You see, irreducible complexity did the one thing you're not supposed to do in pseudoscience. Being a real, falsifiable hypothesis. Irreducible complexity is more or less a rehash of William Paley's watchmaker argument. For those of you who might not be familiar with this argument, it goes thusly. You are walking along a beach and encounter a pocket watch discarded in the sand. You pick it up and examine all the interconnecting gears and springs and hands. You realize that this must be the work of an intelligent agent, and that no amount of erosion, volcanism, etc. could bring such a well-ordered object into being. Of course, the problem is that watches can't do things like reproduce naturally with variations that can improve or reduce their chances of reproducing in the future. So they're not at all a good analogy for living things. Michael Behe is the Catholic responsible for the updated version known as irreducible complexity, which he put forth in his book Darwin's Black Box. In it, he says that a system can be considered irreducibly complex if it is composed of well-matched components such that the removal or absence of any component causes the system to stop functioning. He's unclear as to what constitutes a system, leaving it open that it could be something as small as a single protein or as large as the entire organism. Behe's hypothesis is that such systems cannot come about through evolution, and if such systems can be found in living things, then such systems could not have evolved, and thus evolution cannot explain all of modern biology. It should be noted, though, that this does not preclude any amount of common ancestry, and indeed in his book, Behe is open to common ancestry of all mammals being plausible, which means that while he is certainly an anti-evolutionist, in the broad sense, he allows for far more evolution than young Earth creationists would. The problem for Behe is that if it can be shown that any irreducibly complex system has evolved, then his hypothesis is simply wrong and irreducible complexity is no barrier to evolution. Such things have been shown with his favorite examples, the bacterial flagellum and the mammal blood clotting cascade, as well as with the VPU protein in HIV group 1. The last of those even evolved in historical times. It can also be argued that the evolution of aerobic citrate metabolism in E. coli in the Lenski long-term experiment is the evolution of a new irreducibly complex metabolic pathway that humans watched happen in real time in a lab. So no matter how irreducibly complex the bacterial flagellum is, it doesn't actually matter. It isn't an argument against evolution on the whole, and it was never an argument against irreducible complexity.
If you take the proton-driven motor of a flagellum.
Yeah, flagellum, that's right.
For
that's
example, the little driving appendage to unicellular organisms, right?
Wow, that was a mouthful.
Yeah.
That little structure,
falls apart.
That engine is irreducibly complex.
It sure is. Of course, we also know it evolved from a bacterial secretory system. We know how it evolved. It, on its own, defeats the whole point of irreducible complexity.
You cannot create it by incremental improvement. Mm-hmm. Everything has to be there.
Yes, for it to function as a little motor. But it can have other functions without all the parts. For example, it can secrete chemicals. In fact, modern bacteria still use a rudimentary version of the flagellum to inject other cells with toxins, The above-mentioned E. coli do that when they infect organisms.
It's like a motor. You can't leave the pistons out.
Yeah.
You can't leave the crankshaft out.
Mm-hmm.
You can't leave any of those components out and hope that it'll come together.
Yeah, it won't come together as a motor, but we happen to know that all the parts in the flagellum that are analogous to those parts of a motor also function for other purposes in other contexts.
It has to be complete. Now, that motor is so complex. It has forward gears. It has reverse gears. It has low range. It has high range. It can create torque to overcome obstacles.
Oh, wow. Like a tractor.
It can accelerate. This motor, and it's so efficient, there's nothing that comes close to it.
It is impressive, but being impressive isn't an argument against evolution. Essentially, this is the same argument as big number, therefore God, or look at the trees. The fact that things are cool isn't evidence that science is wrong. It's not even clear what the argument is. It's not clear why cool or impressive things need God in order for them to be cool. Most people think that things like geysers and volcanoes are cool, but I don't think that they're miraculous. Why must organisms be miraculous if they're cool?
And it cannot evolve. It has to come about instantaneously in that configuration, or else it doesn't work.
Well, it can't evolve in the boring way of just slowly incrementally getting better at the function of propulsion, but that's not how it's proposed to have evolved. Instead, a more likely scenario is that the simpler Type 2 secretory system, which already uses rotational motion, in some cases started extruding a structural protein like modern flagellin, which then in one single step, possibly with just one mutation, allowed for limited mobility. After that point, the evolution of more complex gear-like elements and a more refined shape to the flagellin can indeed be reached incrementally.
It's called irreducible complexity.
You already said that, Grandpa.
And it's a major obstacle to the evolutionary theory.
So do they avoid it? Don't want to talk about it?
Well, in 2024, there were just over 6,000 papers that came up on a Google search for evolution of flagellum. So no, scientists aren't avoiding this. Now, because irreducible complexity is an already falsified idea, that itself is not subject to any real research, just like flat Earth isn't. But irreducibly complex systems are researched all the time, with papers being published in 2024 about just one such system at a rate of about 20 a day.
Well, they just add more time. It must have happened somehow, miraculously. Given enough time, it probably happened.
A mutation to change the binding affinity of a secretion complex isn't exactly a miracle. That's a pretty ordinary kind of thing. As for how long it would take, well, there's no way to predict how long it will take until a particular mutation takes place, or any way to really predict in advance how many mutations could have the desired effect. So there's not really a great way to know.
If you leave the diesel engine long enough, it will turn into an F-15.
Well, since diesel engines aren't living things that can reproduce themselves with mutations and differential reproductive success, this is just a bad analogy. In fact, while I don't think Scotty is using it in bad faith, I suspect that the idea of using vehicles as analogies for organisms in evolution may have been developed in bad faith. It's such a poor analogy, I have trouble thinking that it was first used in good faith, but I admit, I don't know who first used it or why, so I don't actually know.
I always say, let's compare our genes to a book.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I always say, let's put our gonads in a vice. Why? Because it's stupid, just like comparing a genome to a book. Genes aren't words or sentences. The genetic code isn't a language, and really, other than being expressible as a series of symbols, there's nothing that a book and a genome have in common. So unless the comparison depends solely on both things being represented abstractly as a series of symbols, then it's going to be a really bad idea to compare them. Now, to be fair, sometimes that is the only thing one is trying to talk about, and in that case, I guess it's a fine comparison, but overall, it's usually silly.
That is written about constructing whatever you're constructing.
That's an even worse idea. The genome is not at all arranged like a how-to book on building something. It has no blueprints, no diagrams, not even really any ordered steps. It's a series of junk, regulatory regions, genes, etc. And during embryonic development, it does not reference some master plan or blueprint. It just has some signals it can send to cells that tell them to divide, die, fold, or differentiate. That's it. It's a bit more like a printed out origami pattern, but even then it's not a great comparison.
Then the question is, all right, you have the book. Who wrote the book?
Books usually list the author, unless the author is unknown. DNA doesn't say, probably because it wasn't written by anyone. Although when Craig Ventnor managed to make a synthetic genome and then replace a cell's genome with his synthetic one, he did put his name in there. So I guess when a genome is intelligently created, we should expect a signature. Odd how it doesn't seem to be there in naturally occurring genomes.
In evolution, it's chance that wrote the book, because natural selection doesn't work at the level of the genes. It only works at the level of that which the genes have produced.
You mean the organism, which itself passes on genes or not, meaning that if selection acts against the organism, it also acts against the genome of that organism, meaning that yes, selection does act on genes. This is like high school level evolutionary biology. I learned this in Catholic school.
I can only determine which one of you is stronger if you're both there. But the blueprint of what you are is written in a book. Who wrote the book?
There is no blueprint. That's not how DNA works. And we know where their DNA comes from. It comes from their parents. And also, we know that it's not the same as their parents, and indeed, their DNA contains variations not seen in either parent. These are mutations, which means we also have a mechanism for causing new variation in the genome. No author required. So no one wrote the genome, which isn't a book.
Chance wrote the book, or God wrote the book.
Well, mutations are stochastic, but by just abstracting it to the word chance, it seems less plausible. But the fact is that outside of genetics labs, the only time we see new variation come into being is by mutation. Walter is welcome to propose another mechanism by which genetic variation comes about, but he'll actually have to then provide positive empirical evidence for it. Just saying God isn't going to cut it. That doesn't explain any data. It doesn't suggest any new question that can be investigated scientifically. It doesn't make predictions. Of course, Walt here does not have any new mechanism that he can actually support empirically. He just really likes the version of God he has in his head and wants him to be responsible for genetics. So he'll just pretend that that's a thing that we can take seriously in science, even though it's unnecessary and unevidenced.
Now, the book is so complicated that what is the probability of the book having been written in the first place?
The probability of an existing genome having come into existence is 100%. Think about it this way. Let's say I have 10 20-sided dice, which of course, I do. Any given roll of those 20 is going to have a chance of being rolled of 1 in 20 to the 10th power. That's 1 in 10,240,000,000,000 exactly. So, if I'm trying to predict the outcome of the roll, I basically can't. But let's roll them. I got 9, 6, 4, 8, 2, 6, 6, 7, 10, and 4. Now, we can go on about how improbable that roll is prior to the roll. Like, what are the odds that none of my rolls would have been above 10? Or that 3 of them would have been 6? Or that 8 of the 10 would be even? And we can figure out those odds. But since that's what I rolled, the answer to the question of what are the odds that I rolled at is 100%. Because that's what happened. I physically picked up a pile of 20-sided dice, I rolled them, and those are the numbers that came up. Similarly, throughout history, various organisms have been reproducing and mutating, and what we have today are the descendants of those organisms. And the chances of their offspring having the genomes that their offspring have is 100%. Now, you couldn't have predicted this exact outcome from the start of life on Earth, but that doesn't really matter to the question. Once an event occurs, the probability of it occurring doesn't much matter.
But even if the book is there, let's say I have the book and it explains how to build an aeroplane.
Which again, isn't how genomes work, and this analogy is so bad it's hard to believe that it's being made in good faith.
If I have the book, how long will it take before the aeroplane appears?
I don't know. I really don't know anything about airplane manufacture, but since genomes don't exist on their own in nature hanging out in a library, it takes anything from a few days to a couple years to grow from a new zygote to a newly hatched or born animal.
It's not enough to have the book.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
You have to.
And this is why I think it's like really great to come at this conversation with. I'm not a scientist, but I understand that.
Scotty doesn't understand it. Even now, with Walt here to help. Part of that is probably that it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so you need the infrastructure to convert that which is in code into that which is a reality. In other words, you need factories, you need workers, you need equipment in order to produce that which actually then exists. So,
and all of that has been a part of life since its origin. Now, if this is supposed to be about the origin of life, that's not the same topic as evolution. We do not have a theory of the origin of life or abiogenesis, but that is something that is being worked on, and a big part of that is figuring out how genetic material became associated with things like protocells that can undergo metabolic processes without genetic material. If that's the gap that Walter wants to shove God into, I won't try to stop him. But the problem is that he doesn't just do that. He wants to also shove his God into gaps that just aren't there. This isn't a guy who thinks that science is correct, but that the origin of life is a miracle. This is a guy who doesn't think humans and chimpanzees are related. If this were math, it would be like a guy talking to you about how he's not sure that you can really divide uncountable infinities into subsections that are also uncountably infinite, while also getting wrong the sum of 2 plus 2. If this were cooking, it would be like someone saying that everyone is getting the chemistry of the Maillard reaction wrong, while also being unsure of how to pour a bowl of breakfast cereal. If this were Elden Ring, he'd be debating power stance movesets while being unable to defeat demi-human Queen Gilka, or not knowing that maybe he should equip his flask of crimson tears.
If that is not subject to evolution, but only the result thereof, the physical entity that can be tested as to whether it is fit or non-fit, then how did that come about?
Yeah.
Since organisms are the only place the genomes really physically exist, and are also the source of the genomes for future generations, selection against an organism is selection against the genome. You cannot select against one without affecting the other. When a new organism is conceived as a zygote, it doesn't download a genome from the cloud or the Akashic record. Gabriel doesn't come down and install its firmware. The genome is inherited as physical matter from both parents. From there, it is replicated as the organism grows. Saying that selection on organisms doesn't affect the genome is nonsensical. The genome is a physical aspect of an organism. We can represent it symbolically, but it's not an immaterial set of symbols. It is a physical set of molecules. There's another reason this book idea is silly. Books are physical objects for sure, but also they're fundamentally a collection of symbols in an order, and if you destroy all physical copies of a book, you can still know the symbols and their order, and you can simply whip up a new physical copy. Genomes do not work like that in nature. If you destroy all physical copies of a particular genome, you have destroyed the organisms that contained it, and there is no way in nature to bring it back. It's gone, because those organisms are also the source of the genome, in a way that physical books are not necessarily the source for future copies.
Even if you had the parts.
Even if you had all the parts.
If you dropped off the F-15 parts in this room, I don't think how smart we are, we could put it together.
How long would they take to assemble themselves?
I don't know, but it doesn't matter. This crew would have to understand the instructions and have the capital to get the job done. Cells don't need to understand anything, and the capital is built in.
By chance.
Right.
It just couldn't happen.
We watch it happen in real time. It happens.
But it had to happen because there's no divine foot in the door.
Yeah.
No, we simply observe it happening, and there are no miracles involved in that process.
That's true.
That's how improbable it is. And that is why evolution is not a theory, in my opinion. It's a faith.
He didn't even give the probability calculation. He just leaned on incredulity. Usually, at least, we get made-up calculations that don't actually have anything to do with the real world. This was far worse than that. We got vague gesturing at prior probability post facto, then absolute nonsense about how reproduction and ontogeny actually work, topped off with a cherry of incredulity. Even morons like Raw Matt usually do better than this.
Good point.
There wasn't even a point at all. I earlier said as a joke that the only cognitive process Scotty has is confirmation bias. I'm now less sure that that's a joke. I'm beginning to think it might actually be true.
So here's another question I have for you, because I've always wanted to ask you this question about CERN.
Veith was a biologist. What the hell could he possibly have to say about CERN?
As limited as I can understand what's going on here, they're trying to break the creation so they can understand how it's built?
What the kind of question is that? What does it even mean to break the creation? They're using high-energy particle collisions in an attempt to learn about particle physics, since some particles can't really be detected or produced at low energy. I have no idea how that means they're breaking creation.
They want to know what it consists of. You know, if you go back
Wait, sorry, what is it?
Oh, sorry, yes, this would be a very good point to explain what CERN is.
It's a particle collider. It accelerates subatomic particles to absurd speeds, then smashes them into each other. Then scientists look and see what happened. I'm going to skip Walter's explanation. Basically, the only even mildly interesting part of it is that when Scotty hears that quarks come in groups of 3, he says it's the fingerprint of God, because I guess anytime the number 3 comes up in the natural world, it's actually because of the Trinity. I feel like the number 3 might exist if the Trinity didn't, but hey, what do I know?
And quantum physics moves into the realm of metaphysics.
No, it doesn't, at least not any more than any other branch of physics. Quantum physics is unintuitive, but it's still about the constituent parts of physical reality: space, time, matter, and various quantum fields. You can speculate about metaphysics on the basis of quantum physics, but that was true about the physics that came before it.
You have to conceive something which is inexplicable.
Mm-hmm.
And what does a quark actually consist of? Well, actually it consists of nothing.
No, it consists of energy. And one of the ways we know this is that we know what the binding energy of a given nucleon is. That is, how much energy it would take to break the quarks apart. And it turns out that it's enough energy to create enough quarks that they still exist in groups of 3, meaning that, like all matter, nucleons are basically just caged energy. That's not nothing. Further, it seems that quarks are fundamental particles, that is, they're not composed of other particles like a proton is composed of quarks. So asking what they're made of, in that sense, doesn't really make any sense.
So at the basis of quantum physics, you have the hypothesis that everything came from nothing.
Nope, that's not a thing. It's a possibility, sure, but that's not the basis of quantum physics.
Now, that's exactly the starting point of the Bible.
Right.
God created ex nihilo.
No, creation ex nihilo, or from nothing, is not in the Bible. In Genesis 1, the earth is presented as already physically existing in a state of unordered chaos. God then comes in and organizes it and brings purpose to it. Creation ex nihilo is a post-biblical philosophical renegotiation of the Bible in response to Greco-Roman philosophical ideas about the eternality and fundamental evil of matter. Walter is welcome to believe that the Big Bang is God creating the universe, whether out of nothing or out of an eternal bit of something. I don't really care. Neither seems to contradict science as we currently understand it. But he's just flat wrong about this being a biblical position, or it being positively indicated by quantum physics.
So what's the difference between science and religion?
Science is an empirically based process of learning about the natural world. Religion is a collection of beliefs and/or practices along with a community. It is not based on empiricism, and instead is generally something a group of people does regardless of any evidence for particular truth claims that may or may not be a part of the religion.
Nothing.
Right.
The one is just deistic and the other one is atheistic, or one is theistic and the other one is atheistic. There is no God and there is a God.
Nope. Science does not preclude the existence of a God. Neither do all religions require belief in a God. Science does not bother with gods, since they aren't part of the natural world. But that's not being atheistic.
So no wonder people like Einstein says, I cannot wait to see the thoughts of God or to see the face of God.
Einstein did not believe in a personal God or a supernatural force of creation. He said himself that if a Christian priest were to assess his belief, they would say he is an atheist. He used God to basically mean nature.
But his concept of God was pantheistic. It wasn't a personal God.
Even that seems generous, but it's closer to true than just pretending that he believed in a God Walter would recognize.
Whereas the Bible introduces to you a personal God, which is totally unacceptable to the scientific world.
Many scientists in every field are theists of some sort or another, including Christian. There is no incompatibility between being a theist and being a scientist. Science requires methodological naturalism because methodological supernaturalism eliminates the ability to draw inferences from empirical data. But that's not the same thing as philosophical naturalism, which rejects the possibility of any supernatural forces or entities. Science is anti-God in the same way that hockey is anti-basketball. It's not that there's some antagonism or incompatibility there. It's just that when you're playing hockey, basketball isn't a factor, and tossing a basketball into the rink would just ruin the game and confuse people.
They will conceive of a metaphysical God, a pantheistic force that is in everything of which you are part, which inherently makes you God.
Which is not what Einstein believed, nor is it a part of science.
Which is something that is negated in the book of Genesis, because that was one of the cardinal lies of the devil, that you will be like God.
Nope, that wasn't a lie in the story of Adam and Eve. That was the truth. God actually confirms this in Genesis 3:22, saying in the King James, "And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become one of us, to know good and evil, and also, lest he put forth his hand and also take the tree of life and eat and live forever." The serpent told the truth, and if anyone lied in Genesis 3, it was God who said that Adam would die on the very day he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But that isn't what happened. Just like the serpent said, it wouldn't happen. Now, you can argue it wasn't a lie and God just changed his mind. I don't care. But one character who absolutely did not lie is the serpent.
Now you take the religious systems of the world and you ask yourself, well, what do they believe? They all believe that you can become God.
No, they don't. They don't even involve a belief in God. And in contrast, some versions of Christianity do teach that you can become a god or like God. In the more variant cases like Mormonism, you can literally become a god of your own world, assuming you're male and do all the right steps. In other traditions, like the Eastern Orthodox Church, salvation is not just freedom from sin, but also the continuous strive to become more and more like God, sharing in his divine qualities. This is called theosis. The idea there is not that you're ever equal to God, since he's infinite, but that you grow in likeness to him. This is why stories about saints in Eastern Orthodoxy often involve things like the saint knowing things they couldn't ordinarily know, and even being in more than one place at a time, because that is the saint participating in God's omniscience and omnipresence to a limited degree. Walter clearly knows almost nothing about religions that are not his own, even varieties of Christianity that are not his own.
But are these like impersonal gods basically that they believe in?
Yes, it's a force.
Use the Force, Luke.
Except that if by they, Scotty means scientists, then no, that is not characteristic of scientists. I'm sure you can find some scientists who believe in a divine force that is impersonal and permeates reality, but I think you'll find more who do not believe that.
Yeah.
The force be with you. I mean,
right.
that's
I know.
getting
It's
into
just a
your
blend
field
of-
now.
Yeah.
We're
Star
jumping
Wars,
into your
such
field.
a blend and mixed bag. Can there be any truth when you mix all these things together? No.
Yes.
Star Wars isn't supposed to be true. It's supposed to be a story about struggle against an oppressive regime. Kind of like Exodus, really.
I don't believe so.
How does the evolutionist not slip into despair?
Some do, some don't for the same reason Kendi doesn't. Others have other reasons, like faith in other religions or a philosophy in which they find fulfillment that isn't theistic. Everyone deals with the horrors of reality in their own way, and yeah, sometimes it's just through despair. I don't care about Walt's answer since he clearly does not understand people who do not think like him. So I'm going to skip his answer. We pick back up with more talk about CERN.
Yes, they're looking for things that they know must exist but don't exist.
No, they look for things that are predicted to exist based on the theories of particle physics, but that have not yet been detected. Sometimes they find them.
How can everything be so interconnected and yet there's vast space of nothingness? So they talk about dark matter.
What does it mean that things are interconnected? How does that interact with any aspect of physics? What makes that hard to explain? What does any of this mean? Dark matter is just the name of whatever it is that makes the orbital velocity curves of objects like a galaxy flatten out, rather than following the inverse square law as would be expected based on simple visual matter. Doesn't have anything to do with any mystical universal connectedness.
That you cannot see, or antimatter and matter, does this one consist of that one? Are they mutually exclusive? Are they going to destroy themselves?
Antimatter isn't hypothetical. It's a real thing that's made in labs all the time, and it is actually a pretty common kind of radiation. Antimatter hits Earth constantly in the form of positrons from cosmic radiation. Similarly, positrons are produced by numerous naturally occurring nuclides, including from fairly ordinary elements like phosphorus.
Point of it is there's a lot of energy in everything, and if you can harness the energy, well, then you get to the first stage, which is the atomic bomb. Eventually you get to the second stage, which is the hydrogen bomb.
This was supposed to be about CERN. CERN isn't making bombs. Indeed, a circular particle accelerator is a really bad way to make bombs, because to reach high energies, you need enormous facilities. CERN has a circumference of 27 kilometers, and it can't make an explosion. Imagine how pointless it would be if you wanted a powerful bomb, but you needed it to be 27 kilometers in circumference, and in the shape of a hula hoop. How would you deploy such a weapon? Would you try to build it in situ? If you had that much operational control over an area, why would you need to bomb it? Nuclear physics isn't the same thing as nuclear weapons, and CERN isn't even doing that. They're doing subatomic physics.
And then eventually you'll get maybe to something which is like the Armageddon of everything.
Fear will keep the local systems in line.
And aim it at heaven.
Yes.
I mean, that's what
and
you're
aim it at
hoping.
heaven.
I guess Scotty knows which way it is to shoot a bomb at God. Usually Christians don't think of God as existing in a particular place, but okay. Maybe that's just another atypical Adventist thing. I don't know. I'm not going to look it up. If you know, let me know in the comments.
So,
At the God that doesn't exist.
I mean,
And in comes Keith to point out that there's no real reason to point a bomb at God if you don't think God exists. That's why the USA never bombed Agrabah, despite being a Middle Eastern country with presumably lots of oil. Turns out, it doesn't exist. Although if it did, you can bet your bottom dollar that the USA would have had some weapons ready to go to liberate Agrabah.
Really?
I think these guys are trying to figure out how this thing is built so that, I look at the devil as the layer behind all of this,
Sure.
right?
Preparing for the aliens.
I'm sorry, so Scotty actually thinks that Satan is trying to use CERN to teach humans how to make a big bomb so it can be shot at God? I mean, that sounds like a cool idea for some trench crusade fiction, but it's absolutely batshit insane as a thing to believe is real.
He's trying every angle he can possibly imagine.
Right angles, acute angles, even obtuse angles.
How do I overtake it? How do I continue it forward? How do I just, he knows his end is imminent.
So he's going to build the biggest bomb of ever and ever at CERN just to shove it in God's stupid face, I guess. And then Jesus is going to show up because he's immune to bombs, and he's going to use his laser vision on Satan, but Satan will block because he has a cloak of laser invulnerability. And then they'll have to start punching each other, but each punch will be so strong it's like another giant nuclear explosion. And then the dragons will show up, but they'll get stuck fighting the cowboy, so they can't really help Satan out. But that's okay, because the ninjas are on Satan's side too. So Jesus has to recruit pirates to fight off the ninja army, and then Captain America, being a Christian, will finally punch Satan in the head, defeating him for all time. And then Jesus can make friends with the ninjas and the dragons, and it will be so awesome, you guys!
Yeah.
And he does communicate. I mean, what are all these channels that are talking to entities?
Yeah.
Fake. They're fake. They're not actually talking to entities. They're either imagining things or they're scammers. No satanic behind-the-scenes magic needed. Humans are super good at imagining things, even imaginary friends that aren't under the conscious control of the person imagining them.
And I've experienced some of these things myself, and they're real. You cannot deny them.
Yeah, you've heard the voices.
Oh yes, I have had personal experience in some of these things. So in this metaphysical world.
Sounds like Walter had a very active imagination, which, by the way, can be enhanced by trance-like states of mind. I'm not saying he's necessarily crazy, although given what I know about him, I'm not going to rule that out. But people with no particular propensity to hallucination can be induced to hallucinate with the right kind of meditation and mindset. So I in no way reject that Walter has had these subjective experiences. But the problem is that there's no way to make that into objective evidence of the real existence of satanic forces. Even strict materialists can have these mystical experiences, and I'm not saying that nothing anyone experiences during such a state has to be fake. Just that the fact that it was experienced is not actually empirical evidence of the real existence of these supernatural entities. So Walter's personal experiences in the matter are irrelevant if he can't provide objective evidence.
So there is something out there. It's divided up into good and evil. Mm-hmm. But what if it's only evil and deception?
Then Walter is clearly on the deception side of the line, given how much he's lied about things in this very talk. We're skipping a bit.
Do you know that Darwin wrote his first notes on evolution and sent it out to other scientists for comment in 1844?
Mm-hmm.
I did know that, yes.
I just found that very fascinating and interesting, because that's the same year in which spiritualism started in the world.
Yep.
Wow, it's also the first year that the first issue of the Swedish language paper Sima was published in Finland. The University of Notre Dame in Indiana received a charter. The Dominican Republic gained independence from Haiti. The USS Princeton exploded on the Potomac River. King Oscar I gained the throne of Sweden-Norway. The Parliament of Iceland was reopened. The opera Hernani debuted. The first Ohio Railroad was chartered. Carlos Antonio Lopez became the first president of Paraguay. The Baha'i calendar began with the Bab privately announcing that the Baha'u'llah was a prophet. The Ottoman Edict of Toleration was passed. The second ever police force was established in Hong Kong. The first telegram was sent. The Great Aqua went extinct. There was an uprising in Prussia. The YMCA was founded. The Great Flood of 1844 happened when the Missouri and Mississippi rivers overflowed. The patent for vulcanization of rubber was granted. Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety was published. Delta Kappa Epsilon was founded at Yale. Joseph Smith of Mormon fame was killed for, himself being involved in terrorism. The USA opened trade with China. British banks were limited in their ability to issue promissory notes. Brigham Young took over the majority of Mormons. Friedrich Bessel determined that Sirius and Procyon were not single stars but binaries. Engels and Marx met in Paris. The first ever international cricket match was played, oddly enough, between the US and Canada. The second great disappointment happened. James K. Polk defeated Henry Clay in the election for President of the United States of America. Hungarian became the official language of Hungary. The Philippines deleted a day from their calendar to switch which side of the international dateline they were on. The safety match was invented. The Tibetan Temple of Guardians burned down. And the Ottoman Empire adopted a national flag. Lots of things happen every year. But that doesn't mean that they're connected or that it's some kind of satanic conspiracy. If you want to say that two things that just occurred on the same year are connected, you need to actually show how they're connected and provide evidence. Walter is just being a conspiracy theorist.
With the wrapping of the Fox sisters.
Yep.
So you have spiritualism very intricately involved in Darwinism. And
there is no evidence that Darwin was a spiritualist, and strong evidence against it. In 1874, he attended a seance and was particularly unimpressed, although he did not stay for the whole performance. We know this because he wrote a letter saying as much to his friend J.D. Hooker. To be fair, the letter is actually dated January 18th, so it's possible the seance was actually at the end of 1873, but I hardly think that makes a difference. Darwin held two major views on divinity and the supernatural during his life. He was a Unitarian Christian and then an atheist. He does not seem to have ever been taken in by spiritualism, despite its popularity in late 19th century England and America.
Darwinism himself belonged to an organization that is called the Ghostly Guild.
No, he wasn't. The Ghostly Guild was basically a group of 19th century ghost hunters based in Cambridge. There is no evidence of Darwin ever joining them, but plenty to suggest that Darwin, by then a materialist, thought the idea of ghosts was nonsense. Walter is just lying about Darwin, and of course it wouldn't matter if any of this were true. Evolution is not accepted because Darwin was awesome and a prophet of science. Evolution is accepted because it has stood up to all manner of scrutiny and it explains huge swaths of otherwise inexplicable data, all while successfully suggesting new avenues of research which themselves bear fruit. I'm done talking about a bunch of 19th century ghost hunters that Darwin wasn't even a part of. Veith goes on to complain that CERN accepted the gift of a Hindu statue by the Indian government. Okay. Keith also mentioned that it's the year that the Baha'i religion started, and it's the year that Joseph Smith died. That's a lot more historical awareness than I would have expected from this group. I guess they know so much since it's an important year for Adventist spirituality, so perhaps it's not as surprising as I think it is.
I mean, everybody sitting around this table can probably witness to a dramatic change in their lives as they were confronted with these issues. I don't know where you all came from, but I'm sure you weren't born perfect Christians to begin with.
I won't at all deny that conversion experiences and dedication to a religion can change someone's life, including for the better. But the problem is that this isn't unique to Christianity. People dedicate their lives to Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, etc., and see a dramatic change, because they have changed their priorities. And if their old priorities were self-destructive in a way their new religiously motivated priorities are not, then their life will improve. For example, if you were addicted to gambling, but then you dedicate your life to Islam, which forbids gambling, then chances are your life will improve, because you'll stop losing all your money at the casino. Similarly, if you're a horrible dick to your friends and family, but then decide to prioritize the Jewish concept of teshuvah, or repentance, you'll start trying to make things right with those you've harmed and do better in the future. Does any of this indicate that Islam or Judaism are the one true religion? No, of course not. It just means that many religions have teachings that, if followed, will probably be able to turn people around from destructive behaviors.
So something must have happened in your lives. And we are going to have to make a choice. Because the scientific world, the political world, and unfortunately the religious world as well, is torn apart by these two entities which are at war with each other.
But they're not, though. That's just the paranoid fever dream of a Seventh-day Adventist. It's not actually real. There is no war between Satan and God over evolution. Whether or not Satan or God are real, evolution is true. Many scientists remain devoutly religious, and most religious people do not have trouble accepting science, up to and including the Big Bang and evolution. It's only the ones who base their religious identity on flat-out reality denial, like flat earthers or young earth creationists, who face this alleged war. I suppose anti-theists are also in this delusional war to some degree, but whatever, I'm not really talking about them. There's a whole world out there full of religious pluralism and science acceptance. It's a much nicer place than wherever these four are living. It turns out you don't have to reject science, you can continue in the religious traditions you love, and we can all treat each other with respect and kindness. If that's the world the Satan Walter believes in is trying to build, then I'm on that Satan's side. I very much would love to see a world where no one is denying science, and that's full of late-night Easter celebrations followed by feasting, where everyone wishes their Jewish neighbors a happy new year on Rosh Hashanah, where Diwali is a time people even in the West get time off to go from work to celebrate with their Hindu friends, etc.
And central in this war is a figure called Jesus Christ.
Christians, I really need you to hear me on this. Science is not at war with you over Jesus. The average scientist either wants you to accept Jesus or doesn't care either way. Science is not here to try to prove or disprove the divinity of Jesus. Until you start going against the clear empirical evidence provided by the real world and spreading misinformation, scientists probably won't even notice you're there. And even if you do that, only a minority will notice, because the majority are too busy trying to expand our knowledge regardless of your objections. Sure, you can find some people who really want you to give up your faith, but that's not most people. It's not even me. I don't particularly care either way. I just want people to do a couple things. Accept reality as it is, and stop harming others who are themselves innocent. That's really it. But I also want the Christians out there to listen to this next part. Too many of you are doing neither of those things, and the people who don't do one of them tend not to do either. Too many Christians out there see both science denial and also horrible bigotry as a part of their Christian identity. You can figure out a way to both accept science and not be bigots. If you think that's not true, then I want you to think about slavery. Virtually no Christians around today think that God endorses slavery and instead think it is an obvious moral evil. Yet the Bible consistently either condones or endorses the existence of both chattel and debt slavery, and has not a single word against either. Y'all managed to figure that one out. You can figure out how not to be homophobic, transphobic science deniers too. I believe in you. Some of you have already managed it. Don't be the people who in 150 years are viewed the same way that we view the people using the Bible to defend slavery before and during the Civil War.
That's why you will find that that is the one that is most denigrated, most mocked, most blasphemed of any religious system in the world.
I have never seen an actual citation for that. It could be true. There are lots of places where Christians are indeed being persecuted. Egypt and Iraq come to mind. Of course, they're not exactly the same kind of Christian as Walt here, so maybe they don't count. I don't really know. But if you want to not be mocked, maybe don't be a bunch of science deniers. When you're the intellectual equivalent of flat earthers, you're gonna get mocked.
And when that happens, then something tells me why. Why is there so much animosity and so much hatred towards this one entity?
I'm going to speak directly to Walt and his ilk here. Because you are fucking killing people. You are spreading science denial, which has contributed to vaccine hesitancy, which is now causing lethal outbreaks of once nearly eradicated diseases like measles. You are making people imagine that climate change is neither real nor a problem. You are creating such mistrust in experts that people are buying into the obvious lies of a fascist dictator. You are trying to leverage pseudoscience to pretend that LGBTQ people basically don't exist and shouldn't be allowed to exist, at least publicly. The reason people are angry at you is that you are actively trying to make the world a far worse place, and I don't want the world to be a worse place. You are attacking the well-being of all humans on the planet, including yourselves broadly, and specifically you are attacking some of the most vulnerable and longest oppressed people in existence. You are far from yourselves oppressed, but hold the reins of political power in the country with the strongest military to have ever existed. You are an actual existential threat to people who never harmed you, and only want to be allowed to exist publicly in a way that makes them comfortable. As I am writing this, the person pretending to the speakership of the House of Representatives of the United States is a young Earth creationist. The director of the National Institute of Health in the former United States is a vaccine denier who has a dead worm in his brain and who admitted to numerous environmental crimes. Support for LGBTQ military members is being removed or has been removed. The food and medical assistance of the most vulnerable Americans are being removed, and you and the people with your ideology are responsible for it. People are dying. There are people who will be dead between the time I write this and the time it goes live on YouTube, and they will have died because of policies implemented on behalf of science-denying Christians. I could be one of them. I don't give a flying fuck if you believe in Jesus. I don't care if you think the Bible is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I don't want myself or the people I care about to have to go into hiding, flee their country, or die unnecessarily. Yet that's what's happening. That is why it feels like people hate you. That's why you're frankly hateful. You epitomize the saying that there is no hate like Christian love.
And so much embracing and acceptance of anything else, whether it be yoga or whether it be transcendental meditation or whether it be Buddhism. Why?
Because yoga, transcendental meditation, and Buddhism are not currently trying to kill me and my loved ones. That's why. If everyone but me decided to do yoga, nothing bad would happen to me if I were the lone person who wasn't doing it. Same thing with transcendental meditation and Buddhism. In contrast, bad things are already happening. People have already died, all because science-denying fundamentalist Christianity has political power. So yeah, you'll forgive me if I'm much less concerned about people doing stretches than I am about people denying virtually all of science and using their ideology as an excuse to oppress people. Walter is not the victim here. He is not the poor, powerless, oppressed person here. He is the blonde-haired, blue-eyed propaganda minister telling you that actually all your problems are the fault of the Jews, the homosexuals, the gypsies, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's the one burning down the Institute of Sexology because it dares to acknowledge that gay and trans people exist. Walter, in addition to being such an absolute total idiot and or liar, is himself an oppressive force making the world worse in a way that fucking yoga just isn't.
Maybe the war is centered around this individual, and that to me says investigate and look and read and make a decision.
But it's not centered around an individual. In this case, he means Jesus. Look at the controversy around Christian Bishop Marion Budde, who spoke out on behalf of compassion in front of the American autocrat Donald Trump. Did you hear the science-accepting non-bigot crowd complaining that she is a Christian and a big fan of Jesus? No, of course not. Because for the most part, no one really cares. We care that she spoke truth to power on behalf of the least powerful among us. There is indeed a war, but it's not between Jesus and Satan. It's between those who want to increase the needless suffering in the world and those of us who want to reduce it. Walter is on the increase side. Bishop Budde and myself are on the decrease side. So regardless of my religious affiliation and hers, she and I are allies. Walter has made himself an enemy of humanity, which happens to include myself and Budde. I'm perfectly happy to be on Jesus' side, when and where that means joining with Christians to improve the lives of the most vulnerable and to fight back against the oppression of the same. It just so happens that that's the side where we normally find the Jesus fans who don't tend to deny science.
Yeah, there'd be no reason, logically speaking, why you would attack that one individual in all these different disciplines. There'd be no reason for that.
Exactly, which is why that's not happening.
There would be no reason.
I'd like you to speak as a former college professor to students who may be watching. I think I can parallel the students' experience with Elijah.
Unless there's a contest between young Earth creationists and non-young Earth creationists to call down fire from either God or Darwin, I'm not sure how.
Elijah, after a spiritual high, after seeing the glory of God, he finds himself in the wilderness, feeling alone, asking the Lord to really take his life. He was depressed, saying, I am the only one here. I'm the only prophet of God left. There's no one else. So you have a student who may be leaving the bubble, so to speak, of their Christian home or their church, and they're moving to a campus that might be very secular, or they're in a class that is teaching evolution, and they might feel very alone in their Christianity and their Christian beliefs.
There's no reason for them to feel like that. There are numerous other members of the student body and even the teaching faculty who are Christians. Most colleges have faith-based student associations, including for Christians. Some even have on-campus religious facilities and services. I once attended Muslim Friday prayers in a college classroom. It was an official school-sanctioned meeting. If there's no such thing for your religion at your school, inquire about starting one.
Maybe they haven't gotten to that point yet, that experience where God is responding in the way that he responded to Elijah.
Elijah heard God in a quiet whisper. If you're hearing disembodied quiet whispers, you should seek medical attention. It's far more likely that you have a psychological or neurological problem than that God is talking to you and trying to keep you from accepting science.
What can you tell that student who may be feeling alone, believing creation?
I would tell them first that creation, in the sense of science-denying anti-evolution or young Earth positions, are not key to Christianity, and also that there are many other Christians whom they can meet and fellowship with.
The university for a believing Christian is a very dangerous terrain.
No, it's not. It's a dangerous place for science denial, but the denialists will be just fine.
A very dangerous terrain.
Christians walking across college campuses need to make a DC 15 wisdom saving throw or take 1d6 psychic damage.
And the probability that you will be drawn away from your belief system is very great.
Well, if by that we mean a bigoted science denialist version of Christianity, then I would say that's great.
And there's a tremendous amount of peer pressure involved as well. And if you put all that together, it is a dangerous terrain for a believer.
Hence the 1d6 psychic damage.
That doesn't mean that I'm saying don't get an education. But what I am saying is, if you are a believer, fortify yourself.
Fortify yourself with extra vitamin D? Good advice. Ricket sucks.
Fortify yourself in the terrain that you are going to. Not all terrains are equally aggressive.
Some only do 1d4 damage.
If you're going to zoology or biology, you're going to be aggressively confronted with an atheistic mindset.
No, you're not. And there's a good chance that your instructors won't even be atheists. I know multiple biology professors, both theist and not. None of them care to push atheism. Instead, they just present what we know about biology and how we know what we know, and how you can show it to your own satisfaction to be true. If that's a challenge for your faith, that's a you problem. If it's not, then good. It was never the goal to challenge your faith in the first place. Once again, the oppressor complains about themselves being oppressed.
If you go into something else like, social sciences and all of these, then the pressure is not so great.
Unsurprisingly, the farther away you get from the science a science denier denies, the less likely they are to experience any cognitive dissonance.
But if you're going into a scientific sphere and you are a believer, then fortify yourself.
What I really hate about this is that what he actually means is protect yourself from actually accepting evidence and assessing data. If you need to fortify yourself against science, it's because the evidence says you're wrong. He's telling people to close their minds to actual truth in favor of his version of truth with a capital T, which is nothing of the kind.
Make sure you understand the issue so that you are not drawn away by counter-arguments.
But what if the counter-arguments are right, though? This literally is Walter saying turn off your critical thinking. Just be a sheep, accept what your parents tell you on the grounds that they told you that if you don't, you're going to hell. The intellectual bankruptcy of Walter's version of Christianity could not be on more full display. The truth fears no investigation. Anytime someone tells you not to take counter-arguments seriously or to ignore them, you can be pretty well sure that they are selling you a lie, and probably knowingly.
Would you be in the mindset to basically say, look into this a little bit and understand what these arguments are coming so that you'll be prepared for them when they do come?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, do that. And if you're going to be studying, let's say, medicine, you're going to be confronted with zoological thinking because it's part of the first year course and the introduction. And the entire system is based on evolution, whether you like it or not.
Because evolution saves lives. Once again, we're back to the fact that if Walter had his way, people would die needlessly. Seventh-day Adventism is a death cult. They want you to be more likely to die than you otherwise would be. They want to increase human suffering. Maybe that's not their conscious or publicly stated goal, but that's the result of people thinking the way they want them to. This is why this nonsense has to be opposed. You could one day be in dire need of medical care, and a doctor could let you die because he disbelieves in evolution, and an evolution-based treatment might save your life. It's not that far-fetched. It has already happened.
So then you really need to be fortified. So look at the other side of the coin. And then the students always ask me, how do I answer something like this? I do not want to answer it.
We already covered this. Time to skip.
I took an anthropology class in one of my first years in a community college.
Dangerous stuff, since anthropology, like more or less all science, directly contradicts young Earth creationism.
And of course, it was just nonstop this. And I actually grew up reading a lot of Spirit of Prophecy, reading a lot of the Bible. And so I kind of had this perspective. And even though myself, I was beginning to exit away from a relationship with God, it was still solid in my mind. And I remember taking the test, and I answered it honestly. And I was like, no, that's not where we came from. And I got a bad grade.
As should be expected, he answered with responses that directly contradict the evidence. Anthropology is an evidence-based field. It's not the venue for counterfactual nonsense. If you give answers in a classroom that are at odds with reality, you should get a bad grade. The classroom is there for you to learn, not for you to grandstand about things you have no knowledge on, especially not when your audience includes people who have forgotten more about the topic at hand than you will ever learn.
I went back to the teacher and I said, you know what, this is what I believe, and here's why. And I think the teacher actually changed my grade based on me answering the questions like that. I wasn't being antagonistic. I was just like, that's what I actually believe.
Sounds like a bad teacher, but if you come to a professor and say you believe things for religious reasons that are at odds with all the evidence, they should not give you a bad grade, or attack you, or anything like that. But on the other hand, tests are evaluations of how well you know the material, and if you give answers that are at odds with the evidence-based curriculum, you should receive a bad grade, and it should not be changed on the basis that your erroneous beliefs are sincerely or deeply held.
And I think even a few of them I answered like that. According to your book you had me read, here was the answer.
Which is perfectly fine, since it shows that you at least know what the answer based on the evidence is, even if you don't accept it.
But this is what I actually believe, and I added some of like the Christian belief, but gave the correct answer based on their books.
In your actual answer in the exam, that's not the best place to state your case.
Yes, very true.
Because when that person is marking, he's marking hundreds of them, and really he has no patience, or she has no patience with a counter philosophy at that stage.
Yeah.
Yep, there's a time and place to bring up pseudoscience with a professor, and it's not during an exam.
If you bring your arguments, bring them earlier.
Yeah, good point.
And write your answer according to what they want, stating that this is according to their theory. You won't be compromising your faith.
Not just earlier, but also outside of class time. Do not disrupt the education of others because you would like to argue against the experts. Even if you're right, which you almost certainly are not, it wouldn't be conducive to a good learning environment.
If for some reason you take a class, somebody starts to put thoughts in your head that challenge your way of thinking, I think that God is such a gentleman. If you come to him and you say, Lord, I have these things that now are throwing confusion into my mind. Show me the truth.
Look, that's just the Mormon asking God if the Book of Mormon is true and getting the burning in the bosom. You're going to get the answer you're looking for. If you want creationism to be true, you'll get a warm feeling confirming that it's true. If you want it to be true that Elvis is still alive and living with aliens, you'll get a warm feeling that that's true. You know how I know? Because I've tried to use this technique. It doesn't work to determine truth. All it does is tell you what you want, which in itself might actually be useful to you. But it's not a way to figure out what the case is in science. Essentially, it's the same as the coin toss technique that I still sometimes use to make decisions when I don't consciously know what my preferences are. I give my two options, each a side on the coin, and then toss it. If I'm happy with the result, then good. The result was my preference. If I'm disappointed about the result, then good. The other option was my preference, and either way I can just go with my preference since as of yet there are no coin toss police. But you know what that technique can't do? Tell me what's true about science.
God is not going to ignore you.
If God is real, then he routinely ignores such things. And the being that you're getting your answers from is just you.
Can I tell you a little story?
Please do.
Yeah.
I was sitting in my office and I was contemplating all of these things, and I said to myself, well, this is so contrary to everything that I stood for, believed.
And for which there is evidence.
I really need some evidence.
Well, he must not have gotten any, or presumably he would have shared it during this interview.
So I went to the library, and I was looking at, we have at the university where I was, probably the largest evolutionary-based library in the Southern Hemisphere.
Wow.
Well, only like 10% of humans live down there, so I guess there can't be too many such libraries, so maybe that's true. I don't really care.
So I went through those books and I looked at them and I stood there and I said, okay, all right, God, if you are in all of this, which one should I start reading now?
And then, wonder of wonders, he himself answered back masquerading as God and told him which book to read, probably based on his bias of wanting his new religion to be right.
I was trying to find answers, so I took a book off the shelf on evolution, and I signed it out, and I was walking out of the library, and a colleague of mine stopped me and said, oh, you've taken that book, there's a new one that just came in, and it's still in a box at the back, a new edition. I said, okay. He said, come, let me show you. So I went in, and we went to the boxes and opened them up, and sure enough, here was the newest edition of the same book.
I needed a new heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they called Shelbyville in those days. So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry cost a nickel, and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 B's for a quarter, you'd say.
So for
Now,
some
where
reason,
are
I took
we?
them both.
Oh, yeah.
And I signed both of them out, and I went back to my office and I read them together and see what was different in the
True
new
scientist.
one. Yeah, what has changed now from the old edition to the new edition?
In my experience, not much. My humble opinion is that except in rare cases, the frequent new editions of textbooks are mostly a scam to get poor college kids to shell out hundreds of dollars for books that probably cost dozens of dollars to make at most, and to prevent them from just using used book markets. But hey, I'm a cynical asshole who definitely does not condone the cool crime of textbook piracy. Also, of course, it's weird that he'd go to a textbook for students rather than just keeping up with the peer-reviewed literature, given that, he's a professor who presumably can in fact do the latter.
And as I came to the story on the intermediary fossils, for example, the old edition plainly said there are no intermediary fossils to base our conjectures on.
Bullshit. Straight up bullshit. He's lying. Intermediary forms have been known since the late 19th century, almost directly after Origin was published. He's just lying. No textbook published in this or the last century by an actual academic publishing house says that.
This is one of the great gaps in the theory, etc. The new one glossed that over entirely with jargon. Liar! And so I went through and I found one after the other where the old edition was still a little bit truthful and the new edition was glossing it over with terminology.
It away.
And I thought, okay, this is a red flag. And that's how I started.
Which editions of which textbooks? Because this is a lie, and until the actual textbooks are produced, I have to conclude that Walter is just lying. Professional creationists are consistently found to be liars. There's no way around this. Every well-educated creationist who makes his living doing creationism stuff lies about things relative to the discussion about creation and evolution. Among creationists, honest and well-informed, you get at most 2. Sometimes people only choose one, though.
It's almost like the devil's theory, right, is slowly changing over time, right? I mean, this is why you just think that it is a theory from the devil, because God says, I am the same yesterday as I was today, and I will be tomorrow, right?
Of course, the reason that science actually adapts to new evidence is because the devil is in charge. Nothing says I'm not a dishonest hack, like not caring about the evidence, which is why that's the God position, I guess. Couldn't ideology be any more intellectually bankrupt, even in theory? Fun fact, following the evidence is a good thing. Ignoring it is dumb and bad, actually.
So the devil's the one that's slowly changing over time, and he's the one that's slowly changing all these things that God's like, nope, it's still this particular animal.
Repackaging the same lie over and over.
I'm out of words. My words have left me. If you can't see why this is the absolute stupidest way to think about the world possible, then I have no hope for you. But hey, if Satan is the one doing the evidence-based reasoning, then once again, I'm on his side.
And then, of course, I had the privilege to go into the field to all of these fossil beds and investigate for myself, were they catastrophic or were they deposited over long periods of time? And I just came to the conclusion after about the 20th, 30th one of them that they were all absolutely catastrophic.
Weird how geologists seem to disagree. It's almost like no one comes to that conclusion unless that's the conclusion they came to before investigating the evidence. Suspicious, isn't it? It's almost like the life of a creationist is so wrapped up in confirmation bias that they'll just make shit up if it helps their case. No wonder creationists love the shit-stained, fraudulent Oompa Loompa they decided to make king despite the fact that he's a cheating rapist. The kind of thing they generally say they don't like.
And therefore a whole new paradigm opened up in my mind. Yeah.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, nothing is more beautiful than willful ignorance and lies.
We are definitely going to put some links to some of your shows that you have created over the years, documentaries, different things that you guys should investigate if you want to look into this topic more.
Yeah, but I won't, because I'm too lazy, frankly.
But this, we were going to have a whole discussion and a whole presentation, but we got into this other discussion, which I hope you guys were definitely blessed for.
If this was a blessing, then I'd prefer to be cursed, thank you. But with this, they're just doing wrap-up stuff, and there are no more real claims to respond to, so I guess I'm done with Veith, at least for a while. If nothing else, this has driven home just how crazy and paranoid Seventh-day Adventists are. Religion is absolutely not a mental disease or delusion. But goodness, if you wanted to make the opposite case, you couldn't do much better than using Seventh-day Adventism to show that at least in some cases it is. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the mouth of madness, and if you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Ferrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek von Mennen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.